Chapter 8:15. There was a phrase in the former dynasty that was used to describe people who were full of unyielding spirit and were willing to cross the boundaries of the camp or even the entire world for their friends. That phrase was, "the machete man who dared to pay homage to a traitor." This was a very ordinary description, but if you carefully tasted it, you would definitely be able to figure out a strong and silent sense of masculinity. There were many people who dared to be a traitor, but very few people dared to pay homage to a traitor when the overall situation was already decided. This often meant that one needed to stand on the opposite side of morality. Morality was the collective will of social creatures, and it seemed to be so strong and invincible since ancient times, because to defeat it was to defeat one's own heart. Sulu was a traitor, but his current identity was even more unacceptable to the Federation than a traitor. He was not dead yet, but he was going to die soon. Tai Zhuan came to see him for the last time in prison, which could also be regarded as paying homage to him. The crown prince of the former dynasty had prepared a pot of plain porridge in advance to be the machete man who paid homage to himself. To have such a friend in one's life, Sulu felt that this drama of life was already worth the price of admission. As the saying goes, a handshake in the midst of thousands of people will make my sleeves fragrant for 10 years. A bowl of porridge will be cold to the world. How warm will my chest and abdomen be? Before Tai Zhuan left, he said that he would try, perhaps just to comfort himself. Before the cold death came, there was still some warm hope, but Sulu did not care too much. Whether it was comfort or not, it was obvious that the crown prince was trying to make Su Li's last days more comfortable. At the beginning of the morning, the military prison efficiently cleaned up the cell that he had smashed into a garbage dump. They arranged a new bed and a small table, and even hung a soft light screen. Sulu did not watch TV, but he could guess what the recent news of the Federation was. Watching scandals and shocking revelations was a very good way to pass the time, but if he was the focus of attention in the news, and the evil camp at that, then this method would become uncomfortable. He rubbed his slightly swollen eyebrows and laid down on the bed, pulling the snow-white blanket over his head. From before the catastrophe to after the catastrophe, from the Federation to the Empire, from the naughty children to the elderly who were about to die, the warm and dark bed had always been the last safe territory that human beings trusted the most. After people were injured or heartbroken, they would crawl into their own bed and block the light from the outside world. This last territory could be easily unified. People could greet His Majesty's pregnant mother under the quilt without worrying about the sharp ears of the intelligence officers. They could do many things that were not allowed by law, and they did not have to worry about the light of the charter breaking through the privacy regulations. In the darkness, Su Li's fingers quietly stretched to the side of the wall. Last night, the crazy smashing to vent his frustration had caused many cracks to appear on the seemingly solid prison walls. He remembered very clearly that there was a standard distribution box in one of the cracks in the cement. His fingers touched a slightly hard feeling. He closed his eyes and pressed hard with his fingertip. The hard material of the distribution box slowly and silently cracked under the magical power spurting out from his fingertips, revealing the complicated wiring troughs inside. As an excellent mechanic, Sulu did not even need to look at it. He only needed to stop his finger for a moment to accurately distinguish whether it was a data cable or an energy cable. He also knew what material the cable was made of. There was no way he would get it wrong. His fingertips moved slightly, and the not-so-sharp fingertips easily cut open the outer layer of the data cable. The hard rubber on the cable slowly and silently cracked open like a fatty who had his stomach cut open, exposing the chromium alloy core wire. The rubber curled up and separated on both sides, really like the hard but extremely thin skin of a fish. In the dark world, he closed his eyes and very precisely controlled the burning power that was generated behind his waist. It slowly passed through his shoulders and upper arms, penetrated his fingertips, and entered the exposed data cable. using the bioelectricity in the human nerves or the zhenqi that was similar to pulse waves to communicate with the machine, and even enter the other's processing structure to control the operation of the machine sounded so ridiculous and lacking in possibility, and there was no reason at all. All the science fiction novels in the Federation had never imagined a story with a similar theme, because the science fiction writers had never come into contact with or even heard of the ability in Su Li's body. Last year, when the Nutshell Engineering Department was conducting experiments in the West Woods Sunset State, Su Li had tried many times with the help of Zhou Yu, but he had not made any effective progress. As for the level of being able to directly control the M52 military mecha with just a few charming fingers like Uncle back then, and making the black mecha feel like dying in the hills, it was even more unattainable. It was the same today but also not the same. Some things had vaguely changed. The high-speed flow of complex numbers in the data cable entered his mind between his fingers, triggering a strange reaction. It did not form a clear image in his conscious mind, only a very strange and vague feeling. He could not pinpoint the specific reason, but he seemed to be able to see on the other end of the chaos. In addition to the central control, the data cable in the wall was also connected to the electronic safety valves of each cell. After an unknown amount of time, he turned over and lay flat on the bed, in a daze under the blanket. He did not know if the very vague feeling in his mind was an illusion caused by his collapse under the heavy pressure, or if his consciousness had really followed the data cable and felt the feedback of information in the distance. Humans were the first order of machines. Did this mean that the bioelectricity in the human body or that strange power could really become a language that machines could recognize? In the hot spring pool in Philadelphia, Li Pifu had once mentioned something about the Yada Zhenqi to him. When the old man was in his prime, he had volunteered to be a test subject for the Federal Academy of Science. Even so, the Academy of Science did not have a precise result, and there was no way to spread it to the entire Federation. However, the Academy of Science had basically confirmed that this kind of training method should be to extract some kind of residual power from the human body that had been passed down since ancient times until it was activated into a specific kind of power. After thinking for a moment, Su Li still could not figure it out, so he thought about it again. He silently held the data cable again, and continuously poured the burning power generated by the back of his waist into it. The more he walked, the more he did not cherish it. If the data cable was a highway bridge used by the prison to control each cell and facility, then what he was doing now was using this highway bridge to test the reaction of the prison. At this time, Su Li was not clear about his control of the power in his body. He had obtained a rare opportunity to improve. It was like the transition of electrons in a crystal ore. There was no qualitative difference in the rotation pattern, but once it was activated, the time required for the release process could be sharply reduced. Being calm in the face of a major event was a realm that very few people could reach. The pressure and crisis of a tense time could often cause creatures to instinctively break through their own limit. There were great terrors between life and death, but there were also great opportunities. In the past, when Su Li encountered major events or even life and death, he could be calm as usual because he believed that as long as he lived a great life, even if he died a glorious death, there would be no regret. The so-called terrors were just normal. However, the difference between today and the past was too big. The death he was about to face had nothing to do with glory, and the life he had once lived had nothing to do with greatness. It was just a sad joke. So he had a strong desire to live. However, since it was already confirmed that he was a person of the Empire, he would definitely be immediately sentenced to death. The Federation did not have any mercy, tolerance, or sympathy for the people of the Empire. There was not much time left. Covered and hidden in the darkness of his own territory, Su Li lay there for several hours. Then, he heard the alloy door of the prison cell slowly slide open. The Major General Warden's cold voice rang out. Fortunately, he was not immediately executed. Instead, He announced a temporary change in the prison's measures. He was allowed to go to the cafeteria to eat his last few meals. Shock, shock, and still shock. Within half an hour of the news report from the Federation News Channel appearing on the screens of millions of households, the millions of citizens of the Federation only had this one emotion from the brain to the body. Their thinking ability was shocked to the point of numbness. Their bodies were shocked to the point of being somewhat stiff. In the school cafeteria with lunch boxes in hand, on the sofa with teacups in hand, and in the bar with hard liquor, people opened their mouths and eyes wide, not daring to believe what they heard and saw. The hero of the Federation, Colonel Sulu, was actually the most well-hidden spy of the Empire? Just as Lady Tai had analyzed in Macho's Back Mountain, although it was still difficult for the citizens of the Federation to accept the truth with Senator Macklin as the scapegoat, the majority of the people believed in this fact in an extremely short amount of time. After all, the results of the two biological marker comparisons were right in front of everyone's eyes. Many people deeply trusted by the people, including Chief Editor Bob, supervised the whole process and, the glory of the Charter would never be wrong. The emotional reaction of the Federation citizens was somewhat strange. After the shock, they felt fear, the fear of the decades-long conspiracy of the people of the Empire. When they knew that the beast of the Empire was lurking around them like ordinary people, this fear was hard to suppress. Then, the fear directly turned into disappointment, anger, and extreme embarrassment. Naturally, people projected these emotions onto the spies of the Empire. Macklin was dead, and all the spies of the Empire had been wiped out. Then, the only person left to bear these negative emotions was Sulu. Even the people who had heard some rumors about the Golden Foundation building back then would not think about it now. Macklin was killed by Sulu. They used to enjoy this rumor to add to the legendary glory of their heroes and idols, but now they subconsciously forgot about it. The relationship between heroes, or idols, and the fanatical citizens was actually very similar to the relationship between the romantic men and the resentful women in the romantic novels. Once they realized that the person they loved had lied to them, and the idol turned out to be made of cheap mud, then the deeper the love back then, the deeper the hatred now. The greater the hope back then, the greater the disappointment now, and the more ashamed they felt. Countless young male students went to the food stalls outside the school resentfully and drank until they were drunk. Then, they angrily smashed all the wine glasses and cursed the shamelessness and despicable of Sulu from the Empire. Thinking of how they stupidly put on black masks a few months ago and marched on the street with their classmates to denounce the Federation government for Sulu, they felt extremely ashamed and cursed even louder. Countless young women sulked at home for no reason, criticized their mother's food, and sarcastically mocked the poor taste of the female military stars on TV. When they gathered with their friends, they raised their orchid fingers and mocked that they had long known that Colonel Sulu was not a good person. His small eyes looked so shifty that they had completely forgotten that the word they used to describe his small eyes was charming. They also forgot that the encrypted electronic diary in the drawer had written down their teenage fantasies and the name of a certain hero. When the hero landed on the ground, other than turning the blurry face into a clear and ugly one, it only stirred up a cloud of dust. Other than that, it did not cause any other movement. After the shocking appraisal in the Bureau of Proclamation building, the Federation government directly released Zhou Yu and Shang Qiu. As for what kind of deep-seated reasons were hidden behind the scenes, or what kind of attitude Mr. President wanted to express to the various forces through this release, it would definitely cause many people to speculate and analyze, but the people involved were not interested in it at all. Shang Qiu directly returned to the Harbor City Industrial Park from the capital. She refused the proposal of the CEO of Nutshell to take a vacation, and ignored the rumors in the engineering department that she might be deprived of her independent technical director by the board of directors. She directly threw herself into the heavy work. Her subordinates and the staff of the engineering department all knew the reason for her recent disappearance. No one would talk about the news related to Su Lu in front of her. They could only watch her work day and night and obviously lose weight. One day, the director of Nutshell's engineering department, Mr. Jose, finally could not stand it anymore and comforted her. Sometimes it's a good idea to lose yourself in work, but you have to take care of your health. I just can't find anything else to do except work. This has nothing to do with losing myself in work, because I don't intend to forget anything. Su Lu is from the Empire. You have to learn to forget. Shang Qiu inserted the pen lead into her black hair, took off her glasses, and calmly said to Mr. Jose, "I'm an engineer. Whether it's a mecha or a washing machine, in my eyes, it's a combination of a pile of metal components and microchip. Similarly, whether it's from the Empire or the Federation, in my eyes, it's a combination of a pile of muscles, bones, skin, hair, and body fluid. There's no difference." In the manner. 10 slightly trembling fingers ran through her black hair. Nan Xiangmei withdrew her gaze from the TV screen, and her beautiful face was filled with sadness. He's from the Empire? How can he be from the Empire? As the current matriarch of the Nan family, Chao Jiaran, of course, knew this shocking news much earlier than the ordinary people. She knew that her daughter, who had long been deeply in love with Su Lu, would definitely fall into the most difficult period of her life after knowing the truth. She had been sitting on the sofa with her daughter. At this time, looking at her daughter's sad and helpless expression, Chao Jiaran sighed faintly in her heart. When it came to love, one would often have to go through all kinds of hardships. For example, she and that wretched fatty had ended their relationship because of the invisible pressure from her family. She believed that her daughter was more determined and braver than herself back then. Whether it was the pressure of family or society, whether it was the division of wealth or power, nothing would shake her daughter's seemingly weak but actually strong will. Even if Su Lu was a hooligan on the streets, as long as her daughter liked him, she would definitely persevere until the end. However, what stood in the way of this relationship was not Jian Shuer, Zhou Yu, or even Su Lu, who was about to die, but something that no one in this universe could resist. In the bedroom on the second floor, Zhong Huiyan, who had just finished washing her hair, sat on the princess bed with her arms crossed. Her slightly wet black hair had long passed her shoulders and hung down on her white nightgown. She stared at the TV screen with her eyes and mouth wide open. After a while, she suddenly frowned cutely and softly muttered a few very indecent vulgarities. She jumped off the bed, picked up the electronic screen, and began to seriously and silently sketch something. The non-flickering blue lines on the electronic screen gradually became denser and clearer. In the end, a map of Nan Xiangmei's manor was presented. Although the electronic map was not completely drawn, it was very precise. Probably no one would have thought that the 12-year-old little princess of the Zhong family could draw such a precise electronic map based on the impressions left by Nan Xiangmei when she took her to the manor for a horse ride. It even marked several loopholes in the manor's surveillance system. The sound of the door opening was heard. Zhong Huiyan hid the electronic map behind the bed as fast as she could. Her small hands quickly rubbed her face, changing the tense and serious expression that was completely incompatible with her age into a little girl's sweet and innocent smile. Nan Xiangmei walked in and directly sat on the soft couch by the window. She stared blankly at the stars above the treetops outside the window. After a long silence, she said softly, "Do you know about that matter?" "Yes." Zhong Huiyan made a sound from the depths of her cute nose. Nan Xiangmei slowly lowered her head and hugged her knees as if she was afraid of cold. She said sadly, "I feel very useless. I can't do anything to help him. And when I found out that he was from the Empire, my first reaction was to forget all the days of the past few years. I don't want to think about him anymore. I don't want to think about whether he can survive. As long as I don't think about him, I can pretend that I have never liked an Empire person that much." Sparkling and translucent tears fell from her eyes. Nan Xiangmei said guiltily and sorrowfully, the first reaction is the truest reaction. That is to say, I don't love him as much as I thought. I'm very ashamed. Oh, don't think too much. Zhong Huiyan walked over and comforted her, for the people of the capital ring, the Empire people and the Federation people are not the same race at all. They are a group of beasts. Therefore, if you fall in love with an Empire person, it is equivalent to having sex. Nan Xiangmei did not understand. She raised her head and looked at the little girl's face blankly. Sex is strictly forbidden even on the 18 forbidden forums. It is the most disgusting thing to do, just like those weird uncles who like girls like me. Zhong Huiyan patted her chest with a smile and said, "Of course, a natural good girl like you can't stand such a fierce thing." What a disgusting description. Nan Xiangmei recalled the scene in her mind. There was no blush on her face, only uncontrollable fear. She looked at Zhong Huiyan with a natural and relaxed expression and said with a trace of confusion and unwillingness, "You just said the capital ring. Don't you people of the West Woods look at the Empire people like that?" "Of course not." Zhong Huiyan waved her thin white arms and said, "We often see Empire people there. There are many prisoners of war and so on. Although I know that those Empire people are bad, but—" She shrugged and her black hair fluttered slightly. "In our eyes, they are actually as bad as the people of the capital ring." It was a very simple sentence, but it made Nan Xiangmei frown very much. She vaguely grasped some key issues. Zhong Huiyan noticed the change in Nan Xiangmei's mood. She coughed twice to interrupt Nan Xiangmei's thoughts and said with great sincerity and concern, "You don't have to feel guilty. Think about how many of our compatriots have the Empire people killed? How many sisters have they raped? How can you fall in love with an Empire person? Sister Nan Xiangmei, forget these things. Su Lu is not the only man in the world." In the dead of night, Nan Xiangmei, who had experienced a strong mental shock, finally fell asleep. There was still a trace of tears in the corner of her eyes. Zhong Huiyan, on the other hand, opened her bright eyes and looked at the ceiling in a daze. Her heart was full of uncontrollable joy. "You are actually from the Empire? That's good. Those women in the Federation who are infatuated with you will probably all run away. I will be the only one who dares to follow you. You are not the only man in the world, but I am the only girl by your side. Then, other than waiting for me to grow up and become a woman, what else can you do?" The cute little girl tossed and turned in bed, unable to sleep. A satisfied and nervous smile appeared on her face from time to time. She was not worried about the safety of that person at all. "Die? How is that possible? You are my omnipotent brother, Su Lu." Inside the villa in the West Mountain compound, after finally successfully calming down her mother's overly frightened heart, she kicked Zhou Liuhua onto the bed. Zhou Yu untied her hair and sat in front of the dressing table tiredly. She looked at her haggard face in the mirror. After a long period of silence, that familiar piercingly cold beauty once again returned to her eyes. She opened the drawer of the dressing table and looked at the little device that Shi Qinghai stuffed into her hand at the Charter Square. She silently thought, if this thing can really avoid the glory of the Charter, then the people who need it the most now are undoubtedly the people of the Empire. The problem is, you are a stupid and ignorant Empire person. Now that you are locked in that damn prison, what damn method can I think of to give you? This was the Qingqing military prison. During the previous dynasty, it was responsible for locking up dissidents. After the Republic, several heads of the 7 families were locked up here. Among the few presidents who were the toughest to deal with the 7 families, except for 2 who were assassinated, one of them was impeached during his term of office. He was serving time for a corruption case, and the location of his sentence was also here. After the most intense and bloody period of the struggle, the 7 families gradually withdrew from the stage and hid behind the scenes. They reached a compromise with the government, and the situation returned to harmony. Since then, this prison was mainly responsible for locking up the most vicious criminals of the Federation. Those who were locked up in the Qingqing military prison rarely had a chance to escape. If someone was really lucky or strong enough to escape, then he would definitely do everything he could for the rest of his life. He would rather die than return to this despairing building complex again. Su Lu had been here before, and then he was pardoned. Now, he was thrown into the Qingqing military prison for the second time. In history, there were no more than 3 people who had encountered the same fate as him. As for escaping, ever since the Qingqing military prison was put into use, such a thing had never happened. No matter how omnipotent a person was in human society, once they entered this place, they would be like a vulture that had lost its wings, or a warship that had lost its crystal mine. No matter how hard they struggled, they would never be able to escape this trap. They would gradually be turned into rotten meat or a cold and senseless pile of steel. The heavy magnetic shackles tore at the muscles of his calves, and the pain was like being cut by knives. The sensor lights around his ankles flashed intermittently, warning the surroundings of danger. There was a sensor-controlled bomb in the shackles, and 3 thick alloy handcuffs that looked like metal rings hung on his wrists. The muscle relaxant that the prison doctor had injected into his body began to take effect. The feeling of weakness spread throughout his body, and it became very difficult for him to drag the heavy shackles on his feet. The heavy alloy bracelet on his wrist pulled his weak forearm downward. It was like an overripe fruit in autumn, and the weight was so heavy that it caused the branches to bend weakly. Su Lu narrowed his eyes and raised his head with difficulty to look at the lead-like thick clouds above the transparent dome of the prison. He wanted to make history, to be the first person to successfully escape from the Qingqing military prison, but he had no confidence. He had not even found a clear way to escape. The strong and violent pulling force passed along the noose to his neck, causing him to stagger forward and almost fall. The Major General, the warden, coughed twice and waved his hand to signal his subordinates who were holding the noose to relax a little. He said in a low voice, "It's already very difficult to get you to come out and eat. You'd better not think too much." Su Lu nodded after a moment of silence. He walked along the magnetic passage to his own table. The crisp sound of metal colliding rang out. On the other side of the transparent wall, the felons who were eating silently looked at the man who was slowly walking past them. They saw his cut short hair pointing to the sky like wild grass, and his beard stubbornly growing roots like a field that had been burned. They all subconsciously put down the cutlery in their hands. For these unforgivable felons of the Federation, this scene was like déjà vu. To be more precise, it was just a boring repetition of the scene from 5 years ago. However, the interval between this repetition was too long. It was more interesting than their daily repetition. It was so long that some of them took some time to remember who he was. "Colonel Su Lu, welcome back." One of the felons stood up and shouted at the guy who was struggling to walk on the other side of the transparent wall. Then, 2 electric arcs hit his body. The military guards walked forward with heavy faces, pulled out the batons at their waists, and began to beat him heavily without mercy. Hearing the sound of hard objects hitting people, Su Lu turned around and looked. Looking at the felon who was twitching in pain on the ground with blood flowing out of the corner of his mouth, he remembered that when he was transferred to Qingqing military prison 5 years ago, it was this person who first smiled at him. In the end, because of this smile, he was locked up in the dark prison for 3 days. He didn't expect that this guy would still be so tough 5 years later. It was probably because the prisoners in this prison, other than challenging the authority of the prison, couldn't find anything else to do to pass the long life that made people want to die but couldn't bear to throw it away. Su Lu smiled and waved at the felons of the Federation on the other side of the transparent wall. The speed of his arm waving was very slow, but in the eyes of the Major General behind him, it was as if he saw the slow-moving arm trying to throw something into the ashes to ignite the flame that seemed cold but hid fierce energy. The food in the prison was not bad. Although it was not as good as the food in the front line, the nutrition was guaranteed. The main dish was potatoes with egg white meat, vegetables, salted cucumbers, and an orange. It only took Sulu a short time to finish the food in front of him with the numbered utensils in his hands. But today, he ate very slowly and chewed very carefully, as if he was chewing all the energy contained in each grain of rice and each piece of potato into nutrients that he could absorb and then store them in his body. He ate slowly and thought casually, accepting the fact that he was a citizen of the Empire, forgetting the feeling of identity tearing brought by the education in the Federation, and not having the painful struggle of literature and art forever, was a very simple thing to do. However, when the incident happened to a specific individual, it would become more complicated. For example, he had to face the fact that in terms of blood relationship, Macklin and County King Carleton were both his close relatives, and even his close uncles, but they were both killed by him. Would this situation be brought to the court of morality? Sulu put the last piece of potato into his mouth, and chewed carefully and even delicately. As his chewing muscles stretched, a mocking smile appeared on his face. No one could judge himself in the court of morality. The problem now had nothing to do with morality. It was only about life and death, and he did not want to die. It was as simple as that. Pushing the plate further away, he took the orange and began to peel it. The white strands under the orange peel were a bit dry. He licked his dry lips and narrowed his eyes. His peripheral vision passed through the transparent wall and fell on the felons of the Federation on the other side. The old man by the window, who was trying to find a few tiny eggs on the orange peel, was called Mend. He was a former professor of the 3 departments of the Federation Military Science Academy, and the best biochemist in the Federation. If it were not for the fact that he used his latest research to break the law and killed his wife's family for no reason, in many people's eyes, he would have won more than 3 Nebula Awards in his life. The bald man who was grinning and looking at him was called George. He looked very simple and honest, but in fact, he was a rare expert in the Federation forces. His hands were stained with the blood of countless enemies and comrades. He was incomparably cruel. This man insisted on calling himself St. George because he believed in a certain primitive religion in the Bermuda Triangle Star region. It was also because of that damned religion that he tore 7 innocent recruits into pieces in the recruit camp. In the court of martial, he insisted that he felt the guidance of the Lord. The man who was smiling innocently like a child was called Charles. He was the most notorious serial killer of prostitutes in the Federation. The first prostitute to die in his hands was his own mother. There was also that handsome middle-aged man who looked like a stone sculpture. What was his name? Sulu frowned and carefully recalled. Oh yes, his name was Tong Jiaojun. He was a person that even he himself was afraid of. Sulu suddenly felt that this scene was very strange. As he shifted his gaze, the identities and backgrounds of these men clearly appeared in his mind. It was somewhat similar to the scene when he led Group 7 to the front lines. The only difference was that Xiong Linquan and the others were truly fearless warriors, while these people were truly fearless criminals. Back when he was transferred to the military prison in Allure, he ate with these criminals through the wall. In the shortest time possible, with the help of the old man, he figured out the identities and abilities of these criminals. It was because he wanted to use these people's abilities to escape from prison. However, he was later pardoned by President Pabre. Naturally, these preparations were useless. Who would have thought that they would come in handy again 5 years later? The prison was still the same prison, and the criminals on the other side of the transparent wall were still the same criminals. Other than men's hair that had turned from white to silver, and St. George's bald head that had more scars and wrinkles, the 5 years did not seem to have left any trace. Then he noticed that an old voice was missing from the other side of the transparent wall. He narrowed his eyes and stared at the orange in his hand in silence. The owner of the old voice used to be the spiritual leader of the prisoners in this military prison. His identity was very mysterious. Even the old man couldn't find a more accurate file except for a citizen number. If someone could sort out the story of this person, it would be a real legend. But now, he had disappeared in this prison without a trace. It seemed that no one could truly defeat time. War godly Pifu could not, and neither could the unknown old man in the prison. Then, could anyone defeat this prison? His fingers sank into the soft peel of the orange. Sulu frowned and thought for a long time in silence. Suddenly, he put the orange back on the plate and struggled to stand up with the help of the table. He looked at the other side of the transparent wall. As if sensing his gaze, the notorious or guilty prisoners on the other side of the transparent wall collectively raised their heads and looked back at him. Their eyes were either complicated or amused. The guards in the military prison, especially the special forces responsible for guarding Su Lo, suddenly became nervous. Orders rang out in the communication system. More than a dozen guards walked towards Su Lo, trying to stop him from doing what he was going to do. Sulu did nothing. He just looked at the prisoners on the other side of the transparent wall, raised the shackles in his hands high, and said, "Live a lowly life, or die a happy death." There was a deathly stillness in the prison. The cold autumn sun suddenly penetrated the thick dark clouds, passed through the transparent dome, and shone on his body. A prisoner on the other side of the wall shouted, "Not enough reason!" The baton and electric current attacked his body. Before he fell, he shouted to the criminals on the other side of the transparent wall, "Because I want to live." The dialogue between Su Lu and the prisoners was written for a long time. It was very hot-blooded, scheming, and evil, but it was seriously inconsistent with the situation, especially because of the time, so it had to be deleted. Today, after returning home, he wrote without rest. He finally wrote 9,000 words. It was very thrilling. It was not a matter of time. The main thing was that he started to feel sleepy at night. If he was any slower, he was afraid that he would fall asleep. He had not updated for 3 days. Of course, he was behind in the monthly vote. It was already very impressive to have so many vote. Now that the cat has started to set off again, I hope that everyone will continue to support him. If he stopped during the double period, he would fall behind again and have to catch up again. It was a very sad thing. But thinking about it, we seem to be used to this situation, and we are very experienced and confident. So, let's do it. Because I want to continue. Chapter 8:16. The entire world was shocked. Then, before the psychological impact caused by this matter, not a single federal citizen would be in a good mood. Only the federal government would be able to shake off the previous stormy environment in an instant and come to the blazing warmth of the sun. The official residents that held the initiative did not use this opportunity to launch an attack on the hostile forces of the capital ring. Instead, by releasing Shang Qiu and Zhou Yu, he vaguely expressed his attitude to all parties. During the war with the Empire, the Federation could allow internal disputes and even internal strife, but it was not allowed to cause a full-scale conflict. This was the great reconciliation technique that Mr. President was best at. He was used to doing it beautifully, using his own concessions to exchange for more concessions from the other party. In fact, the 7 families and the Federation government did not want a full-scale conflict. Since the bloody period of history, the Federation had been peaceful for too long. If a war suddenly broke out, whether it was the Federation government that had scruples or the families that had been at peace for a long time, it would be very difficult for them to fully mobilize their resources and mentally prepare in this short period of time. Today, in the picturesque manor behind Macho Mountain, on the terrace where one could see the lake and mountains, an important conversation was taking place. Probably because people were on the terrace and did not need to open the door to see the mountains, this conversation was particularly direct. In just a few words, countless winds and clouds gathered. If I remember correctly, this should be the first time Mr. President has entered Macho Mountain. Lady Tai gently stroked the smooth handle of the coffee cup with her fingers and smiled at the middle-aged man across the table. President Pabre's expression was calm. He raised his right arm and casually waved as he replied, "It is very convenient to come, but what identity do I have to come with? I have not figured out this identity before, so it is not convenient for me to visit Madam." Lady Tai's smile gradually disappeared. She clearly understood what the other party wanted to express. 5 years ago, in the Federation election, Macho Mountain chose to support Pabre, who was still a member of Parliament at the time, and even accepted Pabre's harsh conditions because Macho Mountain thought highly of him. However, in the 5 years after he became president, Mr. Pabre had not taken a single step into Macho Mountain. Identity was indeed very important. Was he the president of the Federation or the president of the Back Mountain? Pabre was unwilling to visit this picturesque landscape as someone who was supported, even if he was a collaborator. Until today, when the government he led finally had enough strength, or perhaps qualifications, to accept the invitation as the president of the Federation. I can understand the ambition of a politician, even your dream of being re-elected 3 times. Lady Tai said in a slightly mocking tone, but I really didn't expect your ambition to be so far beyond that. You even want to overturn all of us old guys. President Pabre's voice was deep, and his eyes were clear and threatening. Madam, I know what you're thinking. 5 years ago, you surprisingly chose to work with me. Was it just because I had the support of the 3 major unions and some worthless resume? No, it was because Madam had long seen what kind of person I was. You knew that once I became the president of the Federation, I would definitely have some intentions. I would want to leave behind something different in history. I don't deny that after the end of the next term, I want to change the election law and the Constitution and try to become the first president in the history of the Federation to be re-elected 3 times. However, during these 5 years, you seem to have always expressed tacit approval and support for this plan of mine. Why? President Pabre calmly looked at Madame and continued. Because you need a powerful partner to be the first to break the hard and cold provisions of the Constitution. As long as you get used to breaking them, then the follow-up will become very simple. A faint mocking smile hung on his thick lips. After I'm re-elected 3 times, the Crown Prince should have just finished his 2 terms as a state legislator and a member of the Federation Management Committee. You definitely want him to become the youngest president in history. Then, since I, the former president, can be re-elected, why can't President Tai be re-elected? When the time comes, how many times do you want him to be re-elected? 2, 3, or 4 times? Or should I say, let him continue until the glory of the Tai dynasty is restored? President Pabre's eyes were serious and burning as he stared at Lady Tai's face. He was full of pressure. Madam, when it comes to ambition, you are the woman with the greatest ambition in the universe. After being unceremoniously exposed by Mr. President, the ultimate goal of her silent operation for the rest of her life, Lady Tai's eyes turned cold for an instant. She immediately returned to normal and picked up the teacup to take a few sips. Ambition must be matched with equal power. You dare to try to rewind history and return to the era of the reactionary dynasty. Maybe you really think that you are the woman with the most power in the universe. President Pabre looked at the exposed late autumn lake forest. A trace of indifference flashed across his dark face. But please don't forget that I am the president of the Federation. Mr. President, I think that in the past 5 years, whether it is me or those old guys, we have invested enough goodwill and support in you, the elected president. Lady Tai looked at his side profile quietly. After a moment of silence, she said, "It has always been you trying to obtain more things. Those things have even exceeded the limits that a rational person should have." What limits? Who set these limits? Why does the Federation government have to abide by formless limits? Or do you still think that your words can be as powerful as the Magna Carta or the Supreme Court's rulings? President Pabre looked at her mockingly. His tough tone softened a bit. He said, "Madam, you were wrong about one thing at the beginning. My government and I have never thought of overturning you. We just hope that the way this society operates can become more reasonable. The mining preparations for the mining of the Galaxy X have already begun. If there are no problems with the plan, we can start harvesting in about 2 years. These mining planets of the Empire are resources that the Federation forces have exchanged with their lives and blood. But your crystal mining consortium wants to seize the benefits of all the people of the Federation without spending a single cent. This is an extremely unreasonable method." At this point in the conversation, Lady Ty's calm eyes finally began to blossom with a sharp light. She looked at the president coldly and said extremely slowly, "The Crystal Mining Consortium naturally owns all the crystal mining resources in the entire universe. We cooperate in all aspects according to the needs of the government. This is the iron law that the Tai family and the government reached at the beginning of the Republic when we were willing to peacefully give up the throne and all the power. This iron law was even written into the secret Magna Carta. It has been enforced for thousands of years. No government has dared to violate it. Mr. President, your request is a bit too much." "Iron law? Or perhaps it is more appropriate for us to call it a shameful deal," President Pabre refuted in a deep voice. "Regardless of whether it is a deal or an iron law, this is history." Lady Tai looked at him with a serious expression and said very seriously, "Mr. President, I am very clear that it is very difficult for a person with such a strong heart like yours to develop feelings of reverence. But for history it is best for you to show more reverence." "Madam, can I understand this as some kind of threat?" President Pabre was silent for a very long time. His thick black eyebrows slowly rose up. "You have to understand one thing. This is no longer the era of the Empire. With the release of information, it is very difficult for the 7 great families to forever hide behind the scenes of history. Once the people know the truth behind these deals, what kind of extreme reaction will they have? Is this considered a threat that you and the government are issuing to me, Mr. President?" Lady Tai calmly replied. The president shook his head and said in a soothing tone, "Madam, I am not a radical violent person like those in Green Dragon Mountain. I also don't want the Federation to fall into turmoil. These things that I am doing, in my opinion, are only some extremely mild requests and measures." Without waiting for Lady Tai to reply, he resolutely raised his right hand and said, "I agree that the 7 great families still have enough privileges. This is already a concession. Then, madam, you and your companions must also express enough sincerity. I will consider your proposal." Lady Tai's expression was indifferent. She raised the cold tea in her hand. President Pabre stood up. Accompanied by his aides, he walked towards the outside of the terrace. Suddenly, he stopped and turned around to add in a deep voice, "I would like to remind the House of Li to stop trying to obstruct the passage of the additional clause of the Golden Fusion algorithm on Parliament Hill. The days of financial oligarchs using mathematical tools that no one can understand and plundering the wealth of the entire Federation are over. If the House of Li Yuan insists on fighting, I don't mind forcibly dissolving the Parliament and changing the election ahead of time." After President Pabre and his aides, as well as the agents of the Special Task Force hiding in the dark left, the terrace of Mo Chao's manor in the back of the mountain returned to silence. Lady Tai put down the teacup in her hand and quietly walked to the railing. She leaned on the cold white stone railing and looked at the cold scenery of the lake and mountains in silence for a long time. Butler Jean put a pot of hot tea on the table and looked at the back of his wife worriedly. He didn't know what to say to comfort her at the moment. The 7 great families that had accompanied the Federation for tens of thousands of years had finally met a strong opponent. Although they had fought many powerful Federation governments and amazing presidents in the past, the middle-aged man they were facing this time had already demonstrated his absolute control over the Federation society through many things. The biggest difference between this president and the previous presidents was that under his seemingly gentle appearance, there was a strong enough ambition that he didn't hesitate to use special means. What was even more frightening was that through the war with the Empire, the historically weak army had finally stepped onto the stage of history and stood firmly behind this middle-aged man. The 7 great families, led by Mo Cho, had to face a major change that hadn't happened in thousands of years. 5 years ago, when Mo Cho supported Pabre in the election of the Federation president, she probably didn't expect that she was grooming a gravedigger for herself. Secretary Shen looked at the presidential motorcade leaving the manor with a complicated expression. He quietly walked to the terrace and reported in a low voice, "There will be a 3rd reading of the relevant bill on Parliament Hill in the afternoon. That's what the Li family should be concerned about." Lady Tai didn't turn her head. Her voice was a bit bleak because of the cold autumn wind. "Right now I only care about how long Su Lu can live. According to the news from the official residence, Mr. President will sign the order by tonight at the latest. General Li Jiedu has been waiting in the official residence with the military court's death warrant." Lady Tai was silent for a moment. She turned around and leaned against the railing. She looked at Shun Li and calmly said, "Inform our friends in the Supreme Court and ask them to help delay the time. In addition, the people in the official residence should also move. They should try to delay Su Li's execution as much as possible." Secretary Shen looked at her in surprise. He immediately raised a firm objection. "Madam, Colonel Su Lu has been determined to be a seed of the Empire. If we still maintain a relationship with him, it will easily become a loophole for the government to attack. Also, it is impossible to rescue him from the military prison in Qinqing. Even if he escapes from the military prison in Qinqing, it will be meaningless to us. A person of the Empire has 0 value in the Federation. I don't expect Su Lu to survive, but if he can live for 1 more day, he can delay the attention of the official residence for 1 more day. We need time now." Lady Tai paused for a moment and said, "Although he is a person of the Empire, he is still valuable to us. Even if the Supreme Court interferes, or even take the risk of mobilizing the people in the official residence, I don't have the confidence that we can delay the execution of Su Lu by the government." After a moment of silence, Secretary Shen gave an honest answer. Lady Tai looked at him quietly for a long time. Her calm eyes were filled with a faint sense of mockery and oppression. She said, "You were sent to my side by the Trinity Association to carry out the most difficult mission. Since you can still convince Pabre and Li Jiedu to believe that I don't doubt you and still believe you, why can't they believe you more?" Among the idiotic characteristics of the Federation that were often mocked by the royal family of the Empire, the most famous was its cumbersome bureaucratic procedures. This was especially the case in the Parliament Hill, a building full of a rotten and cold smell. Even if it was just reviewing the budget supplemental bill that was urgently needed at the front line, it still had to go through countless troublesome and unnecessary steps. For example, when the hero of the Federation, Colonel Su Lu, was exposed as a spy of the Empire, this was already an ironclad case with irrefutable evidence, but the members of the Parliament Hill still strongly requested that a secret hearing be held. Having just experienced the bitter battle over the additional terms of the financial bill, the members of the Parliament Hill forced themselves to focus their attention again, rubbing their dark circles under their eyes. Right now, there was no one in the Federation who dared to defend Su Lu. Several members of the Parliament who took the stage to speak one after another criticized the royal family of the Empire, who was locked in prison with a stern sense of justice. It seemed that if they did not do so, they would not be able to express their love for the Federation and their hatred for the Empire. It was not known from which corner of the Internet that the members of the Parliament found the so-called evidence, but they actually brought out countless basins of smelly black water and splashed it on Sulu without mercy. They did not even let go of the so-called rotten private life of that rock. When the commander of the Iron 7th Division, Du Shaoqing, responded to the request and reported the process of the pursuit of Sulu to the members of the parliament, a member of the parliament below the stage seemed to be very wise and suggested a possibility. Commander Shaoqing, in your opinion, when Sulu entered the Empire to hunt down Duke Carleton, could it be possible that it was a scheme of the Empire's royal family? He was able to escape Tianjing planet safely. Could it be that he already knew about his background at that time and began to work for the Empire from then on? Du Shaoqing, who was on the speaker's seat, looked at the pot-bellied parliament member with a cold gaze. After a long silence, he replied, "Idiot." The word idiot reverberated in the grand hall of the Parliament Mountain. That parliament member was so angry that his face turned red, and he almost had a heart attack. More members of the parliament started to discuss animatedly, feeling extremely angry. Du Shaoqing walked directly to the side hall, not even bothering to look at these parliament members. For a soldier like him, who valued discipline, to actually say the word idiot in a sacred place like the Parliament Mountain meant that the level of idiocy of these parliament members was beyond his imagination. They were completely unable to control their emotions. As a soldier of the Federation, I hate all men of the Empire, and that naturally includes Sulu. He looked indifferently at Li Feng in front of him and said, "When I was about to kill him, you were the one who stopped me. You should have known what this meant at that time." "I understand," Li Feng replied after a moment of silence. Du Shaoqing calmly looked at the young colonel who was more than half a head taller than him and said, "My troops and I are about to head to the front line. You must take responsibility for this matter. If Sulu survives, you owe me a life." Li Feng was silent once more, and then he said those two words again, "I understand. If anyone wants to save him, or if he dares to break out of prison, I will personally kill him." In fact, there were many things that Madman Li still did not understand. For example, how could that fellow who had once eaten and slept with him for many days be an innately evil and cruel citizen of the Empire? For example, why did his aunt show such a fierce attitude towards Sulu despite knowing that he was a citizen of the Empire? After arriving at the Army Command Center from the Parliament Mountain, he stood at the end of the corridor with his hands behind his back. His posture was as straight as a silent wall, blocking all the officers who tried to enter the corridor. This was because in the office behind him, his aunt and his father were having a conversation that they did not want anyone to hear. You should know very well that if there's only one person left in the Federation who doesn't care if Sulu is a citizen of the Empire, then it's definitely me. In the room, Jian Shuer took off the light-colored hood of her sports jacket and calmly spoke to her cousin behind the table. Her beautiful black hair flowed over her shoulders like flowing water, and the brightness in her eyes was like a lake in autumn. However, this lake contained too many complicated emotions, as well as persistence. Li Jiedu, who had just returned from the president's residence, looked at the black hair floating on the other side of the table. For some reason, he naturally thought of how this girl looked like today before she left Philadelphia for the capital and dyed her hair into that strange purple color. Her beautiful face that had been perfect since she was young was always filled with a sweet smile. She would follow his footsteps and hurriedly run along the lakeside, constantly calling out, "Brother Zidao, Brother Zidao, Brother Zidao." More than 10 years had passed, and he was no longer that wooden military instructor who had just gotten married in his middle age. That little girl who was like his own daughter had also become the national idol of the entire Federation. More importantly, like all girls who had grown up, their hearts had already left their own home, and some of them were reluctant to throw themselves into the arms of their loved ones. "Just because he's your fiancé?" Li Jiedu slowly withdrew his gaze and looked at the documents on the table. He said softly, "Don't forget, Sulu is my uncle's student, and also my father's favorite junior. I don't have any personal opinions about him, but he's a citizen of the Empire, so all these relationships will no longer exist. The feelings between you and him, or the private engagement, must also no longer exist. I'm not talking about the engagement. Jian Shuai took a step forward. After a moment of silence, she said, I don't care if he's a citizen of the Empire, because half of my blood is from the Empire. Hearing this, Li Jiedu's fingers that were holding the digital pen suddenly stiffened. He slowly raised his head and looked at his sister's face. He asked coldly, Where did you hear this nonsense? This is the truth, right? Jian Shuai didn't answer his question. Li Jiedu looked at her expressionlessly. After a long silence, he said, My father said that your mother should be the daughter of the former Master Fan of the Empire. In other words, your maternal grandfather is my father's teacher. I don't think this needs special attention. But he's still a citizen of the Empire, Jian Shuai said stubbornly. Li Jiedu slammed his palm on the table, breaking the digital pen into 3 pieces. He sternly reprimanded, Don't forget that your surname is Li. The blood of the Lees of Philadelphia flows in your body. Even my uncle respects his surname. You must protect the survival of this family, and not think about other things. The office was deathly silent. After a long time, Jian Shuai slowly buttoned up her windbreaker and said softly, I understand. But can you tell me how you guessed that he's a citizen of the Empire? This question was on the minds of many people. Li Jiedu exposed Su Li's identity as a citizen of the Empire, which directly led to the sudden change of the situation in the Federation. The elders of the big families, who were watching the show with cold eyes, were caught unprepared by this storm. After the incident, they found that this was the most difficult point to understand in the big change of the situation. Even President Pabre and Director Chui Zhedong of the Bureau of Proclamation didn't understand how Li Jiedu could find hope in the void and discover such a sharp move on the chaotic chessboard. However, out of respect and even awe of Li Jiedu, they didn't ask any more questions. After a moment of silence, Li Jiedu said, Before my father died, he told me that my uncle is still alive. I think you should also know about this. Jian Shuai nodded. What can this prove? My uncle didn't stop you from being with Su Lu, which overturned a certain guess of many people, including me, Li Jiedu calmly explained. Su Lu is not his illegitimate son. I never thought about this. Jian Shuai lightly shrugged. But I thought about it before, and I believe that the Emperor and the Princess of the Empire must have thought so too. Is this very important? Very important. Li Jiedu gently put down the half of the digital pen in his hand, took a tissue and carefully wiped his fingers. Because when combined with the power in Su Li's body, it can explain a lot of things. The power called true qi comes from the Empire. Even in the Empire itself, only the royal family of the Empire and the people of the Master Fan family can cultivate it. When the former Master Fan visited the Federation, among hundreds of millions of people, only the 2 of us were found to be able to cultivate this mysterious power. I didn't inherit this ability. Even Li Feng had to use medical and physical methods to activate this power. That's why I find it hard to believe that my uncle would wander to Donglin and casually find a genius young man who is suitable for cultivation in that shabby repair shop. The blood of the Lees of Philadelphia can cultivate true qi. This is already a small probability event, probably 1 in 100 million. My uncle so coincidentally found Su Lu, the probability is also 1 in 100 million. Li Jiedu looked at Jian Shuai and calmly said, According to the concept of mathematics, a small probability event has a possibility of existing, but when 2 small probability events are added together, the extremely small probability, we can equate it to 0. In other words, it is impossible for it to happen. There may be a repair shop in some corner of the universe, and there may be a genius student in the repair shop. But there must be an internal logical reason why he is such a genius. There are only two answers that can explain Su Li's power. Either he has the blood of the Li family in him, or he must be a member of the Empire's royal family. The office was silent again. After a long time, Jian Shui shook her head in confusion. She frowned and asked in disbelief, Could it be that you just based on these conjectures, you are sure that he is from the Empire? Conjecture is a good word to use. Li Jiedu replied with a smile, I was indeed guessing, but in the end the facts proved that I guessed right. If that is the case, it means that I have indirectly exposed his identity and sent him to his death. Jian Shui's expression was gloomy. She forced a smile and looked at her cousin behind the desk. She whispered, Brother, although rumors say that my father is extremely cold-blooded and heartless and doesn't care about anything, I really want to know, since he is alive, are you worried about what he will do this time? After saying this, she covered her face with the hood of her windbreaker and turned to leave. Looking at the closed door, Li Jiedu's mood was extremely complicated. He knew that this was probably the last time his sister would call him brother. He was naturally vigilant about his seemingly omnipotent and terrifying uncle, but his father had already left this world. Who dared to say that they could defeat the unknown strong man of the Lees of Philadelphia? There were still several important links about this whole matter that he had not completely figured out. His uncle should have known that Su Lu was a member of the Empire's royal family, so he chose to stay on the Baron Donglin mineral star. What was his intention? From some of the arrangements, it could be vaguely proved that his father should also have some inside information. But why did he ignore it and even tried to let Su Lu take over? Was Su Lu the son of the Empire's Huai Fu Chai, or the descendant of the prince who died in the civil strife? After a while, Li Jiedu withdrew his gaze, took out a new digital pen from the drawer, and continued his work. None of this was important anymore, because the young man was about to die. He is my father's only living son, my younger brother. Huai Chaosher sat on the tourist bench beside the charter square of the Federation. She narrowed her eyes and looked at the fake bronze statue in front of her and the new statue further away. As the famous princess of the Empire, she actually had the opportunity to enter the core of the Federation and see the statue of Li Pifu at such a close distance. It was not hard to imagine what kind of complicated and strange emotions would arise in her heart. However, at this moment, all her emotions were focused on the guy who was said to be secretly imprisoned. Great Teacher, who was wearing the famous winter clothes of the Federation, sat beside her and looked at the statue and the fat pigeons in the square. He observed the expressions of the late autumn tourists, and his eyes were filled with excitement. He murmured at a high frequency that his life was worth it and that he was going to find Skillamo. The two, disguised as ordinary members of the Empire's underground resistance organization, did not need to follow Mu En in the hypocritical conversation with the Federation government. The relevant agencies of the Federation government were also very willing to show the glorious history and beautiful scenery of the Federation to these rural barbarians in the left sky star zone. Of course, every member of the underground resistance organization's diplomatic mission was in a real-time status right now. Who knew how many undercover officers of the military intelligence department were hiding around them? Seeing the heavy expression on Huai Caosher's face, Great Teacher Fan Yuguang suddenly pointed at a young Federation couple who was chasing each other among the fallen leaves and said with a smile, "It really can't be seen from the surface, but these human beings have a small chip behind their neck. It seems that the people of the Federation have really gotten used to living with a dog chain, just like how the people of the Empire have gotten used to living under the rule of the royal family. There is no essential difference." The wide characteristic of the hat covered the middle-aged man's handsome face that did not look like a normal person, making his voice a little hoarse. Then, he said with some embarrassment, "I'm sorry about that matter. I really did not expect that the relationship between you two would almost lead to a big mistake. Because they were deep in the capital of the Federation, they knew that every corner and even the air was filled with the radiance of the Charter of the Federation. Furthermore, the legendary omnipotent central computer of the Federation could obviously understand the language of the Empire, so the conversation on the bench was exceptionally simple and vague. However, Huai Chaosher understood why this crazy uncle of hers was apologizing. When the battleship left the old moon base and was about to arrive at S1, he had already expressed a similar apology. For this crazy great teacher fan who dared to kidnap the princess of the Empire in the name of love, peace, and literature, and tried to use aphrodisiac to make her and Su Lu fuse, such a deep and lasting apology was a rare emotion. It could also be imagined how terrifying that incident was. Even the crazy great teacher fan felt that it was too King crazy. The imperial family and the great teacher fan manor were without a doubt the two places in the universe that had the deepest understanding of the Hakonijinchi, far above the Lees of Philadelphia. Therefore, when Su Lu was captured and brought to Tianjing, everyone from the emperor to Huai Chaosher and the great teacher thought that Su Lu was Nasri's illegitimate son without a second thought. It was only when the news of Su Lu and Jian Shuai's marriage spread that the imperial family suddenly realized that they had made the biggest mistake of their life. The great teacher was embarrassed, ashamed, and afraid that he had tried to make a pair of siblings fall in love with each other to bring peace to the universe. Huai Chaosher was frustrated that she had brushed past her only biological brother and seemed to have missed him just like that. A black mass of people walked out of the majestic Parliament Hill and walked down the stone step. The Empire's underground resistance group had ended their visit to the Parliament Hill. Both parties exchanged opinions. Mr. Mu En and the members praised the Federation's hospitality. At the same time, they expressed that they had been deeply influenced by the atmosphere of democracy and freedom today. In the future, they would definitely promote such a complete elected system in the Zhua Tian galaxy. Huai Chaosher and the great teacher stood up from the bench and walked towards the stone step. Through the crowd, she noticed that Mu En nodded subtly and guessed that the Federation had agreed to that request. Her eyes slowly narrowed as she thought to herself that there was finally a possibility. The fleet drove into the heavily guarded West Mountain compound. Mr. Mu En, who purposely did not wear a leather coat, walked into the independent building with a solemn expression, followed by several of his entourage. This was an unplanned itinerary. The Federation government had refused many times, but Mu En insisted that although Colonel Su Lu had been proven to be a member of the imperial family with dirty blood flowing from every pore of his body, they once had an indestructible friendship after all. He hoped that the Federation government would respect the insistence of the Zhua Tian galaxy men. In the end, they almost reached a dead end. Mu En suddenly lowered his request, saying that even if he could not visit Su Lu in prison, he should at least be allowed to visit Miss Zhou Yu. After all, according to the traditions and customs of the Zhua Tian galaxy, expressing condolences to the deceased's widow was a sacred and inviolable right. It must be said that the Federation government, which knew very little about the Empire, did not have any good ideas when faced with Mu En's insistence, traditions, and customs of the Zhua Tian galaxy. In the room on the second floor, Zhou Yu frowned as she looked at the three people from the Empire in front of her. She was extremely puzzled. Why did they insist on visiting her, Su Li's widow? That fellow wasn't dead yet. Most importantly, when did she become the lover and the mother of his child that Mr. Mu En spoke of, the one that Su Lu couldn't forget during his desperate escape from Tianjing planet? Please take a seat. She politely invited everyone to sit down. In reality, this was the first time she had seen people from the Empire alive, so it was inevitable that her emotions would be somewhat strange. She did not know what kind of drinks she should serve them. Mr. Mu En glanced at Huai Chaosher with a complicated expression. Even he did not understand what the purpose of this trip was. Zhou Yu keenly sensed that the extremely unassuming skinny young man actually had a position far above Mu En's. However, this Mu-In was the head of the diplomatic mission, so who was this skinny young man? And why was that middle-aged man wearing a hat so impolite and flipping through her books without her permission? The great teacher beside the bookshelf turned around, took off his hat, and bowed to Zhou with a smile. Then, he mouthed a silent sentence to Huai Chaoshi. This beautiful lady is actually not inferior to your sister, who is stranded in Philadelphia. It seems that our crown prince really has good luck with women. Huai Chaoshi understood the great teacher's words. Expressionlessly, she reached into her bosom and took out a few pieces of paper. She placed them in front of Zhou in an extremely secretive manner. Zhou, who was stunned speechless by the handsome face of the empire's middle-aged man, subconsciously looked down. Then, she was shocked by the few lines of Federation words written on the paper. She almost cried out in shock. 3 simple lines of words were written on the 3 pieces of paper. My name is Huai Chaoshi. Su Lu is my younger brother. You can tell my identity to the Federation government. If not, then you can help me. Once, when I was interviewed by a female newspaper reporter, she said that you like to bury Easter eggs in books. Can you tell me a few more interesting ones? At that time, Qing Yunian had already finished writing a long time ago. I only remember that I buried them, but I can't remember the specific location. Unfortunately, there are also many spies. After I finished writing, I tried to dig them all up and exhibit them. The relationship between Huai Chaoshi and Su Lu is definitely one of them. Before and after the 40th chapter of Book 4, Starlight Fleeting Time, the great teacher with bare legs with love locked them in a secret room and drugged them with aphrodisiac. Then, Su Lu mentioned Schiller's 8-part symphony. Now that I look back at the plot of the secret room, it should be more interesting. At that time, many of my friends were talking about pushing them down. In fact, if I recall the plot of the 8-part symphony, I might think of the relationship between the man and woman in the secret room. So, I definitely can't push it down. Otherwise, there will be a big mess. Chapter 8:17. Zhou moved her eyes away from the paper with great difficulty. She raised her head and looked at the ordinary thin young man who was close by. Her eyes, which were usually cold and proud, were completely occupied by an expression of disbelief. There was no need to repeat the background narration that the people of the Empire and the people of the Federation remembered deeply. It was enough for her to know who Huai Chaoshi was. His identity and the fact that he had shockingly appeared in the Federation was like a whole bucket of ice that was suddenly stuffed into her stomach in the middle of summer. It was not so easy to swallow. Therefore, there was only one word left in her stomach. Her brain instantly had 4 deep crosses. It was difficult for her to think. She was shocked speechless, and could not come back to her senses. Most people would need a long time to digest such a shocking situation, but what Huai Chaoshi lacked the most right now was time. He had taken the risk to enter the West Mountain compound and admitted his identity to Zhou. There was no way for him to spend more time to persuade her. Therefore, looking at her expression, he frowned slightly in annoyance. However, Zhou was Zhou after all. She was not an ordinary person. She made a decision in a very short time. She walked directly to the dressing table, opened the drawer, and took out a small device that emitted blue light. She handed it to Huai Chaoshi and said quietly, "You may need this. Also, do you know the address?" In the late autumn, the first snow fell in the capital. In the dim twilight, the uninvited snowflakes were covered with a layer of light red. Between the sparse buildings, it was as if there were tons of burning paper slowly drifting down. These burning paper drifts fell on the flat and open lawn in front of the official residence, reflecting a faint luster. The snow-white grass mixed with the evening red, casting a large pool of strange colors. It was very much like the bleeding soldiers wearing dark green military uniforms in Glacier 5460. President Pabre silently looked at the falling snow outside the window. He turned around and signed his name at the signature of the death order document on the table. His handwriting was vigorous and powerful, definitely not weak. The staff of the official residence silently took the document and walked out of the Oval Office to hand it to the people who had been waiting outside. Lee Jae-do looked at the death order document in his subordinate's hand and ordered, "After he dies, bring me the metal bracelet on his wrist." At the end of the wastelands in Huron Province, Qingqing Military Prison had already experienced 3 consecutive days of snowstorms. The perfect independent energy system allowed the prison to still be enveloped in a warm atmosphere. However, the snowflakes that fluttered down tirelessly outside the window made the prison officers feel an inexplicable chill. During lunch that day, Sulu raised the shackles in his hands towards those evil and terrifying felons through the transparent wall and said a few seemingly meaningless words. Since then, the prison had never let him out of that specially designed cell. The prison firmly believed that those felons, who had long been numb to despair, would not have any bold ideas just because of those 2 sentences. They firmly believed that with the perfect security system of Qingqing Military Prison, even if those felons wanted to do something, they would not have any chance. But why did he still feel a little cold and nervous? From the warden to the ordinary guards, looking at the falling snowballs outside the window, they always felt that Su Li's voice was still echoing in their ears. "Live a lowly life or die a happy death. I want to live." These 2 seemingly meaningless words seemed to have become invisible ghosts, drifting around the gloomy and despairing prison. They had drifted for several days, but they still did not dissipate. They constantly muttered and repeated in everyone's ears, buzzing in every dark cell. In a certain cell on the 2nd floor, the burly bald George was kneeling on the bed and praying. His expression was unusually calm and pious. His thick and powerful lips were trembling rapidly as he hurriedly described something in some kind of Bermudian dialect. There was not a single strand of hair on his shiny bald head, so naturally, there was no gray. No one knew that St. George's real age was already over 50 years old. He had spent a total of 17 years in this military prison of his 50 years of long life. The object of his pious prayer was a portrait on the mottled wall. The portrait was made of very simple red lines. It was vaguely visible that it was a naked and bleeding man, crucified on a cross. The painting of the portrait could be described as crude, but for St. George, who had no talent in painting, it took him a total of 3 years to paint this picture of suffering with his own blood. Thankfully, there was nothing in this despairing prison other than time. George had knelt and prayed in front of this portrait for a day and a night. His knees were already worn out. He finally felt a touch of holy light shining on his sinful body. It was incomparably warm. A fanatical expression gradually bloomed on his pious and horribly twisted face. "Great Lord," he almost moaned as he prayed, "I saw your apostle." The sun shone on his body that day. The handcuffs on his wrists were shining. "Just like what you taught us, as long as we are firm enough, the nails on the cross are the touch of a virgin's fingers, and the handcuffs are the bracelets decorated with gems." George lowered his head. The muscles on his neck that were as strong as iron pillars slowly moved. He said in a low voice, "Great Lord, I will follow your apostle into battle." It was already night. Men looked at the night outside the prison through the glass window. There was no expression on his old face. Under the illumination of the searchlights, the process of the falling snow was so clear and moving. That guy said he didn't want to die. Yeah, who would want to die? Although this world wasn't that beautiful, no, it should be said that it was so ugly. After tearing apart the wrapping paper of love, marriage, and family, it turned out to be disgusting maggot. But since he was here, how could he bear to leave? At least there was still such perfect and bright snow. Not only did he want to live, he wanted to get out alive. Just like when he was a child, he stood in the snow in Linhai and acted recklessly. Opening his arms and feeling the slight coldness of the snow falling on his palm, Men's dry lips opened slightly. He laughed silently. Then he thought to himself, that guy should be able to easily shatter this tempered glass window in front of him. However, for him, this transparent barrier that didn't seem to exist separated his snowflakes into two completely different worlds. It was so unbreakable. Retracting his gaze from the snowy night outside the window, the old scholar slowly moved his slightly thin body to the bedside. He raised his head with some difficulty and looked at the entrance of the ventilation tube. Beside his finger was a pile of expensive fiber paper printing. As a scholar prisoner who could still contribute his wisdom to the Federation in the military prison and reduce the deaths of frontline soldiers, he had some small privileges, such as newspapers. Also, this desperate prison had long been numb to the daily life of the prisoners, so it didn't care much. Similar scenes were happening in other cells in the military prison of Qingqing. In the cell around the corner, the pirate leader, who was known for his cruelty, took off the blindfold on his blind left eye. A bloody smile appeared on his wrinkled face. For him, people always had to find something to do in life. What was about to happen must be very interesting. At least he, who was so old that he was about to die, had the opportunity to find a trace of the space air between the Federation and Bermuda. He had the pleasure of crazily robbing the smuggling ships of those big families. In the cell on the third floor with a strange stench there was also an old man. Because no matter how the prison tried to educate him, he was unwilling to increase the frequency of bathing, so the old man's hair was already tangled. It took him a long time to separate the hair with his trembling and skinny hands. He didn't know which corner of the room he was searching for, but he actually found a sharp and hard object. If one looked carefully, they could roughly distinguish that it should be a human calf bone that was sharpened. This was the last carnival riot in the prison a few years ago. The old man secretly took it from a prisoner who was beaten into a pulp. Then he very patiently sharpened it into a sharp bone knife. The metal detector of the prison couldn't distinguish human bones, so he hid it for many years. Under the strict monitoring of the prison, how the old man sharpened this calf bone into a bone knife was the most interesting mystery for the prisoners in recent years. One year, the old voice that had already passed away couldn't suppress his doubts and asked the old man face to face. The old man didn't answer, but just grinned foolishly, revealing a mouth full of intact and strong white teeth. The old man hid his slightly shriveled body under the blankets, using the dim light from the gaps to stroke the bone knife happily. The bone knife had long turned white, and even some black spots had appeared. It had been too long, so long that he himself had forgotten the difficult process of obtaining this bone knife, so long that he was about to forget why he was imprisoned in this prison. The old man's mind was a little confused. He thought about how after he stabbed the child surnamed Lin, the mental hospital said that he was sick at first. Why did the doctor in the court say that he was not sick? The beautiful crying woman's face was twisted in an ugly way. She screamed that she wouldn't let him die so easily and that he would regret it for the rest of his life. He only remembered that twisted face and the saliva that was full of perfume, but he really couldn't remember why all of this happened. "I'm not sick. I just want to stab people. I just like to stab people." The old man hid under the blanket and sobbed angrily. His fingers tightly gripped the yellowed bone knife, and then he began to smile. Some of them were evil in nature, some of them were violent in spirit, some of them had secrets and stories behind them, and some of them had no secrets and stories behind them. They were the most notorious felons of the Federation. They were locked up in this military prison. There were no visitors, no letters, no parole, and no execution. They repeated their days monotonously and terrifyingly, allowing time to wear away their violent looks, strong bodies, and ambitions bit by bit until they were old and numb from the inside out. Especially after the old voice was taken away by time, the old men who lost their spiritual leader lost the spirit and interest to fight against the heavens, the earth, and people. They watched indifferently as their lives flowed away in front of them, but they still couldn't die. Until that ridiculously young man with small eyes came back again, a kind of vitality suddenly appeared in this prison of despair. It was terrifying and violent, and there was no reason to speak of it. It was just to show the cold wall that it was still alive. The short hair that pierced the sky like weeds gradually became more regular under the touch of his fingers. The beard on his face was like a stubborn weed that struggled to grow. Su-Lu silently looked at the snow falling in the night sky outside the window. Looking at the strange guy on the glass, he thought to himself, with his messy hair and beard, "You really look like a passerby in the wilderness." The death sentence came a few days later than expected. Using this very important time, he made more preparations and had a better understanding of the surrounding environment of the military prison. For example, the window glass in front of him had obviously been specially processed. It could even withstand the attack of a rocket. With his current strength, there was no way he could break it open by force. His cell was on the 4th floor. It didn't look high, but in fact, it was very far from the ground. According to the data, the foundation of Qingqing military prison was a large piece of granite that protruded from the ground. Any attempt to directly jump off the ground or escape through the underground water system was impossible. Thinking of this, Su-Lu silently stroked the metal bracelet on his wrist. His thick black eyebrows furrowed. The data left by Feng Yu included the structure of Qingqing military prison. However, he didn't leave any suggestions. It seemed that the guy who had been in prison the most times in the universe also didn't have the experience of escaping from Qingqing. Could he really become the first prisoner in history to escape from Qingqing? Su-Lu silently walked back to the bedside and sat down. His knees were close together. His right hand touched the connector of the data cable and held it tightly. He took a deep breath and his body began to tremble violently. Beep 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 beep. A gentle and rhythmic electronic synthesized sound rang out. The heavy alloy door of the cell slowly opened smoothly. The Federation Special Forces outside the door immediately became alert. With a shocked expression, he raised the gun in his hand and aimed it at Su-Lu, who was beside the bed. Su-Lu didn't move at all. He just lowered his head and calmly looked at the magnetic shackles on his ankles. His hands quietly rested on his knees. Immediately after, a series of soft clicking sounds rang out from the inside of the Qingqing military prison. Each clicking sound meant that a cell had been opened. The gentle electronic sound suddenly became sharp and began to sound the alarm. The sharp sound of the alarm announced the official start of a riot that hadn't occurred in Qingqing military prison for a long time. It was unknown whether it was the bedsheets that had been ignited or some other flammable object had been ignited. Pungent smoke filled the entire prison in a very short period of time. Smoke was rolling out from every cell. For these old villains who had spent most of their lives here, it was not too difficult to understand that they used strange methods to hide the fire seed. The thick smoke blocked the view of most of the surveillance equipment. The staff in the central control room of the military prison were shocked to find that all the alloy doors of the cells were all opened for some reason. Those old but still terrifying and brutal criminals had all run out. The thick smoke drifted between each floor. The sharp sound of the alarm was mixed with the exaggerated laughter of the old villains. The sharpened and yellowed calf bone reached out from the other side of the smoke and stabbed into the waist of one of the guards, causing blood to splatter everywhere. The slightly weakened old man held the bone knife and walked out excitedly and nervously. He stared with wide and confused eyes and walked through the smoke. When he saw a figure, he directly stabbed it. 1, 2, 3. The old and weak body couldn't walk too fast, but the old man's footsteps were unprecedentedly relaxed. He was very happy to stab. The sound of the baton piercing through the air rang out. The old man's back was ruthlessly hit. He fell down in pain. His trembling skinny hand wanted to rub the painful wound, but he couldn't reach it. He looked particularly embarrassed. However, for some reason, when the prison guard behind him was about to swing the baton again, a puzzled expression suddenly appeared in his eyes. He painfully touched his throat and fell straight down. The old man who held the bone knife tightly climbed up with difficulty. His hunched body looked extremely short and small. He glanced at the unconscious guard with some lingering fear and said in confusion, "When there's smoke, you have to walk close to the ground. At the very least, you have to bend your body a little. You don't even know this. I don't know what your elementary school teacher taught you." After proudly recalling the escape education he received, the old man bent his body again. Tightly holding the yellowed bone knife, he slowly walked into the smoke and happily looked for the next guy to be stabbed. The former famous scholar of the Federation, Professor Mend, was still obediently staying in his cell after the riot started. He sat on the edge of the bed and stared blankly at the alloy door that was completely open. His fingers quickly dug into the wall behind him as if he was trying to dig out something. He knew very well that even if he walked out of this cell, he would only be walking into the prison. It was meaningless. Also, the more developed a person's brain was, the weaker their physical strength was. His physical strength was not even enough to swing the heavy baton. He didn't want to be stabbed or smashed into a meat patty by his crazy and violent companions in the smoke after he walked out of the cell. As one of the most intelligent brains in the Federation, Professor Mend's contribution to this riot was reflected in the burning newspaper in the ventilation pipe above his head at this moment. It was unknown what kind of biological agent he mixed in the newspaper, but after it was burned, it triggered a weak toxicity. The smoke was mixed with the smoke released by the burning sheets in the other cells, and it caused a lot of trouble for the prison. Of course, the fact that Professor Mend was able to turn the newspaper into poisonous smoke so obediently through the ventilation pipes meant that other than being an expert in biochemistry, the old man must have also excelled in aerodynamics back in the day. Extremely loud and ear-piercing laughter echoed in the smoke. An obvious reflection penetrated the dim environment. It was a shiny bald head. Thump, 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 thump. The heavy body crushed the floor. St. George, who was almost 2 meters tall, was covered in blood. He waved a large metal plate that he had picked up from somewhere and charged toward the stairs unstoppably like a majestic monster. All the obstacles that dared to stand in the way of this devout and bloody disciple were all blown away, whether it was the hard door or the body of the guards. The ferocious momentum caused the smoke to quickly twist and twist. In the crackling sound, the hard batons broke in the middle. Then, along with the splinters of cement, they hit the wall and fell down, covering the bodies of several people. The bald George rushed to the 3rd floor. Shrill gunshots burst out from the other end of the smoke and outside of the cell on the 4th floor. They hit his chest accurately, and a few puffs of blood burst out. He howled madly and stubbornly refused to fall down. Waving the heavy metal plate in his hand, he slowly, madly, and resolutely walked to the 4th floor in the rain of bullets. In the dim smoke, his shiny bald head and blood-red eyes were so obvious that it made people feel fear. The Small Eyes Special Forces on the 4th floor were responsible for guarding Su Li's cell. According to the authority granted by the superior, they coldly and calmly killed any prisoner who tried to approach the cell. The military prison in Qingqing had countless plans to deal with riot. Even with such a big scene today, the prison did not feel the slightest bit of panic. The central control room calmly issued orders. The fully armed soldiers were already on standby in the military garrison area and were about to enter the cell area. Once the prison troops entered the cell area, after confirming the situation on the 4th floor, they would begin to bloodily suppress this inexplicable riot. However, at this moment, the alloy passage door that connected the military garrison area and the prison area suddenly exploded violently. The huge explosion directly caused the edges of the alloy door to be deformed, and the precision lock was destroyed. The prison troops would not be able to enter the prison area for a short period of time. "Goodbye, my dear blindfold." In the smoke, the old pirate leader squinted his blind eye. The blindfold that was no longer there and the fake eyeball was the last resort of this former big shot. He had not had a chance to use it in the past few decades. Today, it finally caused an explosion. The prison's detection system captured this scene. Since the induction machine gun suddenly sounded, after a very short click, the old pirate fell to the ground and could no longer get up. He stared at the alloy fence with his turbid eyes and looked at the anxious Federation soldiers on the other side of the fence. He coughed up blood and held back his arrogant laughter. The last resort that he had kept for decades, at least he heard a sound and caused some commotion. It was worth it to not follow his blind-eye death. The smoke gradually entered and the alarm was screaming. There were shouts, bangs, and incoherent gunshots everywhere in the prison. Su Lu sat silently by the bed with both hands on his knees. The veins at the tip of his eyebrows occasionally appeared, then quietly returned to the slightly dark skin. There were 4 cold submachine guns at the door of the cell. No matter how crazy it was outside, the muzzles were always so stable. As long as he moved, they would not hesitate to pull the trigger. Because of Su Lu, the 4th floor of the Qingqing military prison was closely guarded by the Small Eyes Special Forces. With the strong firepower, they suppressed all the malicious intentions of the prisoners. Only the half-crazy Bald George was still carrying the heavy metal plate, roaring like a wild beast as he rushed upstairs. That strong and tall body of his was hit by countless bullets. Blood flowed freely, but he did not feel anything. The security system of the Qingqing military prison was completely independent of the Federation's network, but it had a very high-level response ability. In a very short time, the automatic defense system of the cell area was activated. The backup ventilation system began to exchange air with high power outside the prison. The anesthetic shooting valve next to the dim light in the corner began to shoot intensively. The riot was still going on, but it was obvious that the Qingqing military prison had begun to gradually control the situation. Su Lu, who was waiting for this opportunity, and this was the only opportunity to escape, still did not move. Suddenly, a pure white pillar of light descended from the sky, instantly illuminating the dark snowy night and the desolate wasteland. It tore apart and melted hundreds of millions of dancing snowflakes and blasted into the prison of despair. Chapter 8:18. In the outskirts of the capital, deep under the Bureau of Proclamation building, the two-dimensional light screen with the green waterfall of data suddenly froze for a very short time. However, because the time was too short, the human eye couldn't see it at all. Therefore, it didn't attract the attention of the few Bureau of Proclamation workers underground. Immediately after, the Federal Central Computer didn't hesitate to use the alarm to express its attitude of being ignored by the human race. The mechanical electronic synthesized sound rang in the Bureau of Proclamation building and underground. Although it was gentle, it created a strong sense of tension. Warning: external data is attempting to invade the core program. Warning: invasion failed. Beginning identification and tracing of data traces. The Bureau of Proclamation building suddenly fell into chaos. From Director Cui Zhedong to the normal screen operators, they all listened to the alarm echoing in the building. Their hearts were filled with infinite shock. Who was able to break through the 81 layers of defense of the Federal Central Computer and directly invade the core program? Although the other party's invasion attempt failed and the old thing began to fight back, which computer expert in human society could reach such a terrifying level? Then, something shocking happened. After a short pause, the cold mechanical synthesized sound of the Federal Central Computer sounded again. It even sped up the speed of the sound. Warning: abnormal situation number 73. Serious warning: this is the first sequence of events. The light Feather-class battleship Morning Dawn took off from the old moon base and began its routine orbital cruise mission around planet S1. However, not long after the mission began, the officer in charge of determining the route on the battleship discovered an extremely strange situation. The captain of the Morning Dawn stood in front of the three-dimensional space star map and looked at his subordinates with a gloomy face. He sternly scolded, "The orbit of the ship deviated by so much. What did you trash eat to grow up? Why did the Morning Dawn come to Huron State?" There were more than 2,000 Federation soldiers on the battleship, but no one could answer the captain's stern question. This was because whether it was the orbit calculation or the deviation of the engine, it couldn't explain why such an advanced battleship would mysteriously come to the edge of the atmosphere 70,000 kilometers away from its original target. In a remote cleaning room on the Morning Dawn, the hard cabin wall had been forced open. A cable thicker than a girl's wrist was easily cut open with a small knife. A mid-data cable that could be bought at any computer market was connected to an inconspicuous workbench computer with the cable. We were discovered again. The man in the janitor's uniform sighed regretfully and slowly stopped his fingers that were tapping on the virtual keyboard on the light screen like the wind. In fact, he was already an old man, but for some reason, or perhaps it was his obsession, there were not many traces of age on his face, and he could easily disguise himself as a cleaner or repairman. "But I don't want to admit defeat." The janitor smiled and reached out his index finger. He gently tapped the data cluster that looked like a button on the light screen of the workbench. With a low hum, the dawn brake suddenly began to tremble. The tremor came without warning, and many officers in the warship almost fell. They held on tightly to the edge of the equipment to barely stand, but then they heard the soft voice of the ship's computer, and as many as a dozen officers' legs went soft, and they fell heavily to the ground. "The blade-tip main cannon has been fired. Please check the results of the battle." Hearing the gentle confirmation from the ship's computer, the 2,000-plus Federation soldiers on the Morning Dawn were petrified. They looked at the white beam of light that had just disappeared into the atmosphere in horror. They could not believe their ears and eyes. Was that the main cannon fired by our warship? The captain of the dawn brake looked at the light screen with a strange expression. His hands that were hanging by his legs trembled uncontrollably. At this time, not only was his expression gloomy, even the Major General star on his shoulder seemed to have dimmed. His warship fired the main cannon at the planet where the Federation government was located. Was he trying to rebel? The captain knew very well that no one could bear this kind of responsibility. His military career would come to an abrupt end after he became a major general. What he was truly afraid of was whether he would be charged with crimes against humanity and locked up in that terrifying military prison. While all the soldiers on the dawn brake were in a state of confusion and fear, the man disguised as a janitor had quietly left his original area and quietly entered the escape pod of the warship. Before leaving, the man turned around and looked at the dark blue and gray planet outside the porthole. He smiled coldly, revealing 2 rows of ugly yellow and black rotten teeth in his mouth. "On a certain planet in Bermuda, in a private space dock. Boss, the Linz laboratory has already given a verification report of the material we cut off last time. The material of the outer components of the spaceship should be a certain kind of alloy. Whether it's hardness or ductility, it's the best known alloy, but they can't analyze all the elements and ratios in all the alloys." The armed leader looked at his boss with a troubled expression and suggested, "Since this broken spaceship can't be opened, why don't we just cut it open with brute force?" Although the alloy material is very hard, just like the last time, we can be patient and cut it open slowly, just like last time. Tisk tsk tsk. You only know how to cut them off when you play with guns and knives. The Bermuda smuggler waved his arms angrily and pointed at the strange broken spaceship that was quietly parked in the space dock outside the window. He screamed, This is a work of art. The most perfect work of art. Do you understand how much technology and aesthetic value this spaceship contains? You only know how to cut it open. Last time, when you cut off a small piece of the spaceship, it already made my heart ache. Now you still want to cut it open? The armed leader muttered in a low voice, a spaceship that was randomly put together from a pile of alloy junk. Other than being a little stronger, what's so special about it? Art, my ass, what do you know? The smuggler reprimanded without holding back. Look at the Federation Empire, and then look at our Bermuda Empire. The most expensive works of art are definitely the ugliest and most trashy things in our eyes. This spaceship is the same. This smuggler, who had quite a high status in Bermuda, was almost robbed by this strangely shaped broken spaceship during the last smuggling trip. Who knew that the strange spaceship would suddenly lose all its power and be secretly dragged back to his private space dock by the greedy and bold man? In the eyes of the smuggler, this broken alloy spaceship was a work of art. It was also the riskiest and most successful investment in his life. He would not allow anyone to try to harm this treasure with violence. It seems that there is only one way to open it in perfect condition. The smuggler looked at the quiet broken spaceship and said with emotion, "We can only wait for the people in the spaceship to open it themselves." The armed leader held his forehead and said helplessly, "How many days has it been? The spaceship has lost its power source, and the life support system has stopped working. The people inside must be completely dead. They have long become dried corpses. How can it open by itself?" As soon as he finished speaking, the broken spaceship that had been quietly parked in the dock suddenly lit up. The engine at the back of the spaceship suddenly roared. The staff in the dock were shocked by this sudden change. The smuggler and the armed leader behind the office glass looked at each other in confusion, not knowing what to say. "Intruder! Intruder! Activate immediately!" Accompanied by a cold mechanical electronic alarm, the broken alloy spaceship roared out of the dock and rose into the air. More than a dozen extremely thick fixed chains were broken in succession. In the air about a few hundred meters above the ground, the spaceship flew at an almost crazy speed. This dilapidated spaceship did not look like a spaceship at all. It looked like a few hundred metal dumpsters that were randomly piled together. As it flew back and forth at high speeds, the metal dumpsters looked like they were dangling and trembling, as if they would fall off the spaceship at any moment. The broken metal spaceship suddenly swooped down from the sky and instantly reached the dock, completing a move that completely violated the design philosophy of human aircraft. It silently floated above the people's heads. The spaceship sounded again, but for some reason, the cold mechanical electronic voice gradually turned into a very human voice. One could even hear the fear and confusion of the owner of the voice. "Who am I? Who am I? Who am I?" The voice repeated the question 3 times in a row, and then suddenly became extremely angry. It roared at the people in the dock. "I feel that I should be an omnipotent existence. Why is my body trapped in this cramped, dirty, mechanical, cold, and broken spaceship? Why? Did you do it?" Adding so many negative comments to the spaceship that it was in so easily and continuously, it was obvious that the anger of the voice was very real. "It's not me who did it." The smuggler was full of fear of the unknown. He replied with a trembling voice, his teeth chattering. When he thought that he might have offended the Mummy Empire that could develop such an advanced spaceship, he wanted to die immediately. The broken metal spaceship shouted angrily, "Tell me who I am first, or I'll kill you." The smuggler and the armed leader opened their mouths wide and pointed at each other with their fingers, anxiously trying to think of a name for each other. But in such a nervous and chaotic state of mind, how could they do it? "I am Xiao Fei?" Suddenly, the voice of the broken metal spaceship said hesitantly. Then, the voice became clearer and clearer, more and more certain, and more happy. "Yes, I am Xiao Fei. Phillips Fei." But why am I trapped in this pile of broken metal? Damn it! And it's castrated. There was no telling whether it was the second personality of the old guy after his schizophrenia or the rebirth of the remaining information left in the spaceship before his death. In short, a brand new life, Xiao Fei, was controlling the only spaceship that he could control, flying to the distant space zone of the Federation. The tri-winged spaceship was like a streak of light, cutting across the night sky of Bermuda. It was extremely beautiful. The smuggler behind the window wiped the sweat on his forehead with trembling hands and said to the armed leader, who had a pale face next to him in a hoarse voice, "If he comes back to find the part that was cut off, I have to admit that it was you who did it." That beautiful pure white light beam pierced through the atmosphere and instantly melted countless snowflakes. It silently fell into the military prison. There was no explosion, no fire, only the high temperature formed by the terrifying destructive energy. In an instant, it left behind a black hole that went deep into the Earth's crust. The staff in the central control room of the prison got up trembling and walked forward. The metal floor not far away had been burned into a smooth curve, and the shape of liquid metal droplets could be seen at the edge. There was nothing in the middle. The computer rack, the central control computer on the rack, and the cup of coffee next to the computer case all turned into smoke and disappeared in an instant. Looking down, there was a large hole that pierced through several floors of the floor. It penetrated deeply through the hard granite of the base. Looking up, there was only a large black hole in the dome of the prison. The snowflakes that filled the sky were pouring in along with the cold wind, whistling and dancing in all directions. There was no explosion or fire, but the temperature in the prison suddenly rose, and the oxygen content in the air seemed to have a clear process of decreasing. Instinctively, both the old villains and the Special Forces soldiers on the fourth floor subconsciously looked in that direction. The beautiful beam of light that fell from the sky made the chaotic and crazy riot suddenly come to a halt. Su Lu, who had been sitting silently on the bed, took advantage of this very short time to move. His body moved before he moved. His left hand grabbed the Special Forces soldier at the door from afar. His fingers made a crackling sound, and a strong chi gushed out from the cell. It was as if there was an invisible force, and it actually took the gun from the soldier's hand. The Special Forces soldier outside the prison cell turned around in shock, but he could only see the alloy door closing quickly. Su Lu pulled the trigger and destroyed all the monitoring devices in the prison cell. Then he twisted his arms strangely to the back of his head with a calm face. The metal bracelet on his left wrist had already opened, and the sharp metal thorn inside it buzzed slightly and aimed at the back of his neck. In his heart, he provoked the cold computer that occupied the old man's body almost crazily. "I know you can see it. Try to kill me and see." Without any hesitation, he slightly tightened the muscles on his left wrist, and the metal thorn that protruded from the bracelet suddenly popped out, penetrated his skin and muscles at a high speed until it penetrated the cervical vertebra and accurately entered the tiny chip deep in the bone graft. With a muffled groan, the severe pain instantly occupied Su Li's whole body. His face was paler than the snow outside the window, but he refused to faint. He quickly closed the bracelet, spat out a very thin metal wire from his mouth, and began to remove the 3 alloy handcuffs on his arms. He narrowed his eyes, steadily controlled the movements of his hands, and felt the resistance from the front end of the metal wire, and reconstructed the internal structure of the lock in his mind. With a click, the first handcuff was open. Then, the second handcuff was also open. Snatching the gun, closing the door, firing the gun, removing the chip, and removing the handcuffs, he completed these actions without any hesitation. Like a snow cloud blown by the wind, like a smooth flowing river, extremely fast, but not panicked. The coherence between the actions was very rhythmic and very clear. At this time, any panic would lead to death. Even if the situation was very tense, and life and death were on the line, The calm mind of a repairman from Donglin Repair Shop was still strong enough to control all of his actions. With a low muffled sound, the heavy magnetic shackles on his ankles were finally removed. However, Su Lu did not immediately move to the next step. Instead, he narrowed his eyes, and his fingers pinched the metal wire and quickly operated the shackles on his ankles. Finally, he flipped a hidden switch on the ship's south bridge. He threw the magnetic shackles far away to the ground near the window, and with a muffled groan, he forcibly lifted the fixed bed to barely cover his body. Outside the cell, the members of the Special Forces looked at the tightly closed alloy door in front of them, and their faces were pale. This cell was specially designed, and even Su Lu would definitely not be able to escape. However, they did not know why, but looking at the tightly closed alloy door, they always felt extremely cold. They could not see the scene in the cell, and they could not hear the sound in the cell, but they knew that the other party was trying to escape. The member who had his gun taken away felt a strong sense of uneasiness and began to madly smash the door. The small red eye pattern on the armband became particularly ferocious and terrifying with the intense movements. The commander of the Special Forces listened to the order from the earpiece, waved his right hand forcefully, and shouted, "Detonate!" Boom! The electrically controlled bomb in the magnetic shackles instantly detonated. The bomb that was enough to blow Su Lu into pieces only blew a hole in the ground near the window that was barely big enough to pass through. Su Lu threw away the burning bed in his hands, and without hesitation, he silently rushed towards the hole. That night, when he was madly smashing the door in the cell, he had already discovered that this specially designed cell was unusually strong. Instead, the ground, which the designer did not expect, was relatively the weakest side. The electrically controlled switch that he had flipped in the end weakened the power of the bomb in the shackles, but it was still enough to explode. Amidst the falling cement debris, Su Lu descended from the sky and arrived at a cell on the 3rd floor. The moment his feet touched the hard ground, his next action was to extend his left arm. Professor Mend, who seemed to have waited for him for a lifetime, did not show any expression of surprise. He silently patted off the cement debris on his body, walked forward, and stabbed the syringe in his hand into Lu Boyern's left elbow. There was no need for a plastic rope, no need for padding, no need for disinfectant, and no need for the nurse's sweet comforting. The sharp needle pierced through the cloth accurately and accurately stabbed into Su Li's vein, pushing the medicine in almost violently. Perhaps the needle pierced through the vein wall, and some of the medicine flowed into the muscle, but these two people definitely did not care about these insignificant details. Su Lu did not have time to ask Professor Mend where he got the syringe and medicine. He took a deep breath and activated the burning power in his body, stimulating the medicine to flow faster in his vein. For the past few days, the military prison in Chingcheng had been injecting muscle relaxants into his body. Although he had been resisting with his strong body, muscle relaxants were not biological toxins after all. They were extremely close to the double fiber of his muscles. Without the help of the professor downstairs, he definitely would not have been able to complete the follow-up plan. Professor Mend glanced at him, probably wanting to ask what he should do next. The smoke in the corridor outside the cell was gradually fading, and there was already the sound of hurried footsteps. Su Lu took the syringe from Professor Mend's hand, narrowed his eyes slightly, and looked at the transparent glass on the window. He took a step forward and arrived in front of the glass. It was just a simple step, but the well-proportioned muscles on his body were like breathing steel. Under his skin, they tightened and undulated. The majestic power instantly spread throughout his body. Finally, it faintly seeped through the bones of his arm and passed to the needle. The sharp but exceptionally thin metal needle seemed to magically harden at this moment, making a low hum in the air. Su Lu silently raised the syringe and stabbed it into the hard-tempered glass. The strength that had increased after the injection was all concentrated on the thin needle tip. Pew 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 pew. A series of dense crisp sounds rang out, like 12 male woodpeckers angrily pecking at an empty tree to show that they were occupying territory, or like hundreds of needles landing on the smooth and hard surface of the mecha. The needle in his hand stabbed the tempered glass dozens of times in an instant, like a storm, as fast as lightning. A perfect circle appeared on the hard tempered glass, and at the same time, there were 3 lines that converged from the circumference to the center, like a capital letter V. Su Li's fist smashed into the center of the letter V. When his fist came into contact with the hard surface of the glass, he couldn't help but think of a certain scene from years ago. In the 4 States Mountain Foundation building, when he broke through the security door and killed Macklin, or rather, when he killed his uncle, he had also used this method. The hard glass shattered like the snow outside, but as soon as a crack appeared in his heart, it was fiercely mended. "Take me away!" Professor Mend shouted behind him. The cold wind that poured in from the window messed up his white hair. Sulu didn't answer. His right hand grabbed the professor's neck, and he wrapped the professor in a blanket. With a kick of his feet, he jumped out of the broken window. Allure Military Prison was built on a protruding piece of granite, surrounded by flat wastelands. From afar, it looked like a strange retro castle building. Although this cell was on the 3rd floor, it was at least 20 meters away from the ground. Even if Sulu was in his peak condition, he wouldn't be able to escape unscathed from jumping from such a high place, not to mention that he was carrying a living person and a quilt in his hands. The 2 people fell from the sky, whistling through the air, faster and faster than the fluttering snowflakes, and directly smashed toward the ground. When they were about 5 meters from the ground, Sulu raised his eyebrows. He suddenly exerted strength in his right hand and threw Professor Mend, who was wrapped in the blanket, diagonally out. Meanwhile, he landed on the snowy ground without any fancy move. After 3 days of continuous snowstorms, coupled with the fierce winds in the wasteland, a thick layer of snow nearly 4 meters high had accumulated under the outer wall of the prison. With a muffled thud, Sulu smashed into the thick layer of snow, splashing up a few inconspicuous pieces of snow. A moment later, the surface of the thick layer of snow suddenly began to distort, as if an ice monster was trying to burrow its way out of the ground, squeezing the snow and ice until it rustled uncontrollably. A hole appeared on the side of the layer of snow with a boom. Sulu, covered in snow, rushed out at high speed, charging forward. The bullets fired from the firing platform in the direction of the prison grazed past his footprints and sank into the snow, creating a neat row of bullet holes. In the shallow area to the east of the snow layer, he grabbed Professor Mend, who was lying limp on the ground, and continued to charge forward silently. His feet darted left and right on the snowy ground, perfectly displaying the evasive maneuvers of a mecha battle. He narrowly avoided the increasingly concentrated shots behind him. He ran at high speed on the snowy ground. It looked like he was running aimlessly, just to avoid the bullets behind him, but in reality, he didn't move much from left to right. He ran steadily in a straight line towards the east. In the blink of an eye, he had already crossed the first line of defense of the military prison. Then, he covered both of their bodies with a blanket. Without any hesitation, he crashed into the electric net that was already covered with thin icicles. After calculating that the electric current was limited, in the ear-piercing sound of tearing metal, this electric net was directly torn open by Su Li's terrifying speed and machine-like body. Finally, they reached the forest outside the prison. If they continued to head east, they would enter the wasteland. Sulu was still silent, not slowing down. Professor Mend, who had been held in his hand the whole time and forced not to make a sound, began to speak with a trembling voice. "Although my wife is a little too talkative and loves money too much, she's not a bad person. I really don't want to kill her. I just want to kill her disgusting parents. Who knew she would leave work early? The wife's parents are all men's natural enemies, haha. The professor murmured something in a low voice and then slowly closed his eyes. Su Li's footsteps suddenly stopped. He found that there was a terrifying bloody hole in the old man's chest. He didn't know when he was hit, but he couldn't help but squint. Putting Men's body on the snow, he gripped the gun on his shoulder tightly and continued his escape in silence. With the help of the map in the bracelet, he had already planned the route after escaping from Qingqing military prison. The charter computer couldn't locate him. As long as he passed through this forest and forcibly broke through the 3 ground defense lines, this escape would be completely according to his plan. I can't let you live, because if you live, you will definitely go to the Empire. Right at the edge of the forest, a tall and strong figure appeared in the night. Snowflakes fell on his shoulders, but they didn't melt. Instead, they were directly shaken away. Looking at him blocking his way, Su Lu stopped again. He frowned and said, "I won't go to the Empire." The tall and strong figure slowly walked toward him. At this moment, the high-powered searchlight network of Qingqing military prison was all turned on. The wilderness within dozens of square kilometers, including this forest, suddenly became abnormally bright. The heaviness and ruthlessness between the young colonel's brows were very clear. "People of the Empire have to go back to the Empire," Madman Li said with a complicated expression. "The Empire already has a princess. If you were to join us, I won't be able to handle it alone." Su Lu knew what to say in this situation, what to explain, so he just narrowed his eyes, took down the MP5 submachine gun on his shoulder, and pulled the trigger in that direction. Almost at the same time, the Kayan light machine in Madman Li's hand also rang. The bright and beautiful bullet tip instantly cut through the already bright snowy night, but it didn't hit anyone's body. This was because when they pulled the trigger, both of their feet were deeply embedded in the soft snow, driving their bodies to abruptly increase their speed and begin to dodge. The 2 strongest men of the Federation finally began a battle that belonged to them. How astonishing was the momentum and how frightening was the speed. The snowy ground in the forest suddenly exploded into countless snowflakes. The terrifying sounds of gunfire continued without end. The shrapnel danced and then fell through the air, striking deep into the snow or withered tree trunks. While shooting, they dodged at high speed. Their speed seemed to have already surpassed the speed of the bullet. It was as if they were 2 lines circling some invisible center, running clockwise on the snowy ground at high speed. In this world, only a battle between these 2 could create such a strange situation. Madman Li's mad dash was incomparably mighty and ruthless. The snowflakes roared and shook behind him. In contrast, Su Li's dodging seemed even more nimble and fleeting. Other than shallow footprints, he actually didn't leave any traces on the snowy ground. The circle formed by the footprints on the snowy ground shrank inwards. The bullets of the guns in their hands had long since been exhausted. As they finally collided in the center of the circle, both of their hands attacked each other at the same time like lightning. It was also a powerful close combat technique inherited from the Lees of Philadelphia. With a bang, the strength of the snowy ground violently spurted out. After rapidly compressing, it exploded, shaking the snowflakes that filled the sky and suddenly drifting away. It was unknown how many withered trees above their heads were instantly broken. Su Lu, who was mentally and physically exhausted, was ultimately not an opponent of Madman Li, who had been silently waiting for a long time. He was shaken and flew diagonally, falling heavily onto a tree trunk. Blood dripped from the corner of his mouth. His squinted eyes were still bright, but they began to reveal a faint self-deprecating smile. He didn't want to fight. He only wanted to escape. He only wanted to live. However, he was stopped here by this madman. From the other side of the searchlights of Qingqing prison, the faint whistling of helicopters could be heard in the distance. Madman Li pressed forward step by step with a complicated expression. Suddenly, he stopped. His clear and handsome black eyebrows suddenly rose. He looked into the depths of the forest and suddenly felt an unprecedented danger approaching. The snow in the forest was chaotic. The wind suddenly rose. Su Lu suddenly felt a gust of wind pass by his cheek. That person rushed over from the depths of the autumn forest at high speed. Along the way, he was wrapped in wind and snow. He didn't hide at all. It was unknown whether it was because he didn't have time to hide or because he disdained to hide. Like a bright bolt of lightning, he directly smashed toward Madman Li. Facing an unprecedented sense of crisis, looking at the person who shook the snow like a god, Madman Li's scalp went numb. He clearly smelled the smell of death. He was not afraid. Instead, his fighting spirit soared. He madly and violently roared. The military uniform on his body was completely shattered. All the strength in his body collectively erupted and fiercely met the attack. Under the violent burst of strength, the drifting snowflakes were like shrapnel. In a flash, the two people didn't care about life or death. They didn't fear life or death. No, it should be said that they didn't care about life or death. They threw their incomparably terrifying fists at each other. Bang! 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 The deafening explosion exploded in the forest. It was like someone was holding a big hammer and crazily hitting a broken car. This kind of momentum was no longer like a battle between two normal people. It was more like a battle between two metal mechas. What was inconceivable was that the person from the forest didn't use any close-range techniques at all. Instead, he tyrannically chose to use force to suppress the enemy. This could be said to be fair and square. It could also be said to be the feeling of supremacy brought about by absolute confidence. Madman Li was known to be invincible in the military. His fighting style was abnormally crazy and violent. However, this person from the forest was actually crazier and more violent than him. The violent battle suddenly began and ended in an instant. Madman Li let out a muffled groan. Just like Su Lu, he was fiercely shaken into the tree trunk. Blood quickly flowed from the corner of his mouth. His injuries should be more serious. He stared at the thin man standing in the snow. His eyes seemed to be burning. He wanted to burn away the hat that the man was wearing and see the face clearly. It was because he had already guessed who the other person was. The Empire's princess, Huai Chaoshi. All of this happened too quickly. It was only now that Huai Chaoshi, who was standing in the snow, recognized who that exceptionally tyrannical Federation officer was. Her eyes couldn't help but narrow slightly, revealing biting cold killing intent. They were the most outstanding experts on both sides of the universe. When they were both very young, they were already lifelong enemies in the eyes of the Federation and the Empire. However, this battle happened without any warning in the snow outside the prison. This battle on the snow couldn't completely reflect the difference in strength between the two sides. Both of them were most proficient in this type of ruthless and crazy fighting style. The most important thing was aura. Madman Li silently waited outside the prison for many days, but he still couldn't develop the determination to definitely kill Su Lu. Meanwhile, Huai Chaoshi held the determination to definitely save Su Lu. Huai Chaoshi understood this point clearly. That was why when she saw Madman Li slowly stand up and felt the berserk fighting intent that was even stronger than before, she definitely wouldn't underestimate the other party. However, she definitely wouldn't fear any enemy in this universe. Huai Chaoshi stared at the powerful enemy who slowly stood up. Without turning around, she said to the fellow behind her, "Little brother, I'm taking you home." "Going home?" Su Lu silently watched her back. His eyes that were usually as calm as usual no matter what kind of situation he encountered suddenly became a bit muddled and difficult to understand. Madman Li slowly wiped away the bloodstains at the corners of his lips. He stared at Huai Chaoshi's face and coldly said, "Your Highness, I don't think you have this chance." Su Lu raised his right arm and wiped away the blood at the corners of his lip. He looked at the two of them and suddenly said with a smile, Madman, now it's your turn to choose. Chase her or chase me." As soon as his voice fell into the chaotic snow, he turned around without hesitation and madly ran out of the forest. Wide Sousher's reaction was extremely fast. She gave Madmanly an indifferent look before suddenly turning around and madly running west. This was the first time the imperial siblings of the Empire officially met. However, in just an instant, they once again split up and ran in opposite directions. Madmanly's body stiffened slightly as he stood in the snow. Regardless of which of the two escaped, it was a loss the Federation couldn't afford. Who should he chase? With a roar of grief and indignation, he chased east. There was no reason. If he had to find a reason to choose Sulu over Huaichaosher, perhaps it was because compared to the possibility of capturing the Empire's princess alive, he was more concerned about not letting Sulu truly become a citizen of the Empire. The bright searchlight net illuminated the wilderness outside the prison as if it was daytime. From the direction of the prison, one could clearly see that Su Li's figure was desperately running on the snow. Although he only had 2 legs, he seemed to be running faster than a helicopter. On the wall on the east side of the prison, there were prisoners slapping the window and cheering loudly as they watched that guy running away. Some prisoners took off their underwear and shook their soft breasts while screaming, cheering for that guy in their own special way. These old criminals who had committed heinous crimes didn't care whether Sulu was a citizen of the Empire or a citizen of the Federation. They only cared about this snowy night and whether that guy could become the first prisoner in history to successfully escape from the military prison of Qingqing City. In the snow not far from the prison, a few police dogs smelled the scent and led the military police to the body of the former famous scholar of the Federation, Professor Mend. The professor's messy white hair was tangled by the snow. Inside the prison, there were still remnants of smoke. George, who insisted that he was blessed by the holy light, collapsed on the stairs. The heavy metal plate was overturned on one side. His body was covered with bloody bullet holes. His shiny bald head was dyed in blood. Until his death, he didn't make it to the 4th floor. The leader of the interstellar pirates who once roamed the universe panted heavily as he lay in a pool of his own blood. No matter whether it was his eyes that were blind or not, there wasn't much life to be found in them. An old man with a hunched body cowered in the corner of the prison cell. No one knew where the yellowed bone knife was hidden. The long snowy night passed. The sun rose. At the edge of the wasteland was a green peninsula that extended to the sea. The island was filled with lush plants that did not match the season, and was full of vitality. Below the island was a sharp reef. With a bang, Sulu stepped on the wet and soft soil of the peninsula. His thin face was flushed due to extreme fatigue. His body was shaking so hard that it seemed that he could collapse at any time. 400 meters behind him, Madmanly, who was also extremely tired and on the verge of collapse, finally relaxed after confirming that he had chased him into a dead end. He greedily breathed in the slightly moist and salty sea air. Further behind him, the blurry shadows of more than 10 Federation helicopters appeared on the horizon. The low roar came from afar and was instantly swallowed by the loud sound of waves hitting the reef. It was hard to believe that these Federation helicopters, which were known for their high mobility, couldn't outrun the 4 legs of Sulu and Madmanly. After a short break, Su Li's narrowed eyes flashed with a strong sense of determination. He dragged his legs that seemed to be carrying several tons of mecha components and sprinted towards the sea with great difficulty. His feet stepped on the green plants on the peninsula and for some reason it seemed to be getting easier and easier. Madmanly stared at his back, strong confusion flashing through his eyes. He didn't know why that guy was still holding on. The sea in the distance had long been controlled by the Federation Coastal Patrol. Where else could he run to? Looking at that guy who was struggling to move forward on the island's rugged path, he thought to himself, fall, hurry up and fall. However, Sulu still didn't fall, so he could only raise his tired legs again and chase after him. As if it was his last run, a run from a city of despair to the sea of despair, Sulu ran to the shore full of sharp reefs. He suddenly stopped, turned around, and said with a smile, "Hey!" Li Feng sat down on the slippery gravel and asked while panting, "What is it?" "There are two things I want to tell you." "Speak." "The first thing is, without the help of those guys, you wouldn't have been able to catch up to me. Do you know why?" Madman Li frowned and asked, "Why?" Sulu answered very seriously, "Because you're heavier than me." "The second thing is—" The small-eyed man turned around and looked at the roaring sea under his feet and said softly, "You guys won't be able to catch me anymore." Madman Li slowly narrowed his eyes and stared at his back on the reef. He said sternly, "Suicide is the act of a coward." The waves surged fiercely towards the reef, as if wanting to swallow everything. Under the illumination of the rising red sun, they formed a transparent wall. "A rock will never commit suicide." Sulu smiled, his neat white teeth reflecting the warm sunlight, and then he jumped down from the reef. The figure smashed through the seemingly solid and transparent wall of water and threw himself into the cold and angry sea. Then he swam down with all his might, deeper and deeper, as if he wanted to swim to the deepest part of the sea and become a truly free fish in that home that belonged only to him. Chapter 8:19. The red sun leapt into the sky. The angry ocean, seeing that it could no longer restrain its rise, returned to calmness resentfully. The reflection of the white clouds on the blue ocean gently rose and fell. However, immediately after, this peaceful and beautiful scene was disrupted by the waves created by countless ships. The Coast Guard ships of the 3 neighboring states were all gathered on this ocean. They moved quickly through the waves. Fully armed soldiers stood on the deck, vigilantly and nervously searching the ocean surface. They were ready to pull the trigger of the guns in their hands at any moment. The various underwater monitoring devices on the Coast Guard ships had all been turned on. Above the atmosphere of this ocean, several military satellites carefully monitored every square centimeter of the ocean's surface without missing anything. There were submarines even further away at the bottom of the ocean speeding over. Under the powerful cooperation of the charter computer data, the Federation government had already completely controlled this ocean that spanned hundreds of kilometers. Even if a curious sea turtle poked its head out, it would be discovered immediately. However, time passed by minute. Other than the white waves created by the ships, the ocean's surface remained calm. They didn't discover anything. The target of the Federation's search seemed to have really sunk to the bottom of the ocean and become an ugly hard rock among the beautiful coral reef. Even if it was cold and dead, it wouldn't float up. An area of the blue ocean suddenly began to surge violently. A few nearby Coast Guard ships approached at high speed. They released automatic ropes and pulled up the person who floated up. The officials on the ships wanted to ask something, but when they saw the person's expression, they didn't dare to ask. In the snowy forest, the military uniform on his body had long been completely shattered by the energy. Li Feng only had a small pair of underwear on his body. His naked body was suffused with a bronze color. His slowly moving muscles contained terrifying power. Seawater dripped down from his hair and brows. His entire body was soaked. He looked particularly wretched. "Where are you hiding?" He raised his brows and looked coldly at the calm ocean surface. His sharp gaze seemed to penetrate the ocean and land on the deepest part of the beach. Gradually, the sharp gaze dimmed. Li Feng felt incomparable disappointment and anger for unknown reasons. He let out a violent roar and swung his fist down heavily, creating a terrifying hole in the deck beside him. From the wasteland to the east, one would reach the ocean. The extension of the continental shelf here was particularly magical. Less than 2 kilometers from the beach and the reef, the seabed would rapidly sink, forming a deep trench with an average depth of more than 2 kilometers. This was the famous Naya Trench in Huron State. When making an escape plan, Sulu did not hesitate to choose this sea as a transit point to avoid the glory of the charter. The charter computer seemed to be everywhere and omnipotent, and even in the vast space, there were not many gaps. However, when it came to the deep blue sea on the surface of the planet, there was still not much that could be done. The blue seawater seemed gentle and transparent, but it was the biggest challenge for human technology. As long as the target entered the depths of the seawater, it would be difficult for the monitoring instruments of the relevant ships to obtain an accurate image. It was the same for the high-precision military satellites outside the atmosphere. In other words, the glory of the charter could not completely illuminate this blue sea. Sulu might have dived to the real bottom of the Naya Trench, which was as deep as 18,000 meters. The heat loss caused by the low temperature was not considered. The most important problem was that without the help of professional equipment, no matter how strong the human body was, it would not be able to withstand more than 1,000 atmospheres of pressure. His current location was on a light-colored water cliff 312 meters below the sea. What did 312 meters mean? The Federation's record for weighted diving was 110 meters, and the record for unrestricted free diving was 199 meters. Even the best divers would only accelerate to a certain position with weights on their backs when they were doing unrestricted free diving. After that, they would immediately throw away the weights and quickly rise to the surface of the sea. No one dared to stay in that kind of extreme position for too long. According to legend, the brave person who set the record for unrestricted free diving in the Federation was intoxicated by a certain light in the darkness of the seabed when he was trying to break the 200 meters record. He stayed there for a moment and became a heroic soul in the blue sea from then on. And Sulu was sitting cross-legged with his eyes closed on the cliff 312 meters under the sea. No one knew how long he had been sitting there. His skin had been soaked in the sea for too long. It was pale white and was about to lose its elasticity. However, the muscles under the skin were still very elastic. They contracted and relaxed rhythmically as if they were alive. They resisted the omnipresent pressure of the bottom of the sea. His bones, which were several times harder than normal humans, did not feel any pressure at all. His lungs were filled with seawater. There was no trace of air, which balanced the pressure inside and outside the body. Therefore, there were no tiny bubbles escaping from his mouth and nose. He slowly raised his head and squinted his eyes to look up. His eyes penetrated the dark blue seawater and caught all the light. He stared at the distant sea that was about to become a hole. Madmanly had been here before. She was more than 100 meters above his head. She did not notice him at all. Even if she saw him, she would probably only think that the messy short hair was the seaweed that stubbornly survived in the sea. After all, no one would have thought that someone could dive so deep into the sea. There was no need to deliberately control it. The scorching power turned into countless fragments and wandered in Sulu's body, making up for the damage and providing the oxygen needed for survival. On the Empire's Red Rose, he was interrogated by the experts of the Intelligence Bureau using water torture. At that time, he was already able to stay in the water longer than normal people. Later, he was reborn in the hospital bed of the Empire. His meridians were shattered, but he made another breakthrough. After escaping into Fong Lake, he was able to swim freely like a fish. This was a very strange state. Sulu, who was in this state, had never figured out whether he was squeezing the oxygen in the lake and sea water through his skin and lungs or the magical genuine qi in his body directly turned into the oxygen needed by his body. However, this was not important. He only needed to know that he could survive in the sea for a long time, but the Federation government did not know. This was enough. It was because of this magical ability that he chose the Naya Trench. Or it could be said that the Blue Sea chose him. Then, He became the first person in history to successfully escape from the military prison of Chinching. On a certain remote beach, countless water droplets suddenly dripped down. The soft and delicate beach was hit so hard that it looked like the bandit sign of a famous interstellar pirate. The coconut trees did not feel the cold of the north at all and stood proudly in the wind. The sky was full of wind and rain. Someone was coming from the sea. The tired figure directly broke through the waves and walked to the beach. The bare feet that were soaked stepped on the wet and soft beach. It was like stepping on a hot red stone. It was extremely painful. Maybe it was because of the pain, or maybe it was because he had just completed 20,000 miles under the sea. The magnificent feat was too weak and tired. When the figure just walked to the beach, he obviously could not control his body and stumbled. It was not until he ran into the shadow of the coconut forest that his movements became coordinated and faster. He opened the bracelet and opened the map. He squinted his eyes and carefully checked for a few minutes to make sure that he did not deviate too much from the planned route. This coconut forest beach had not been developed yet and was a low surveillance area. Relying on the unkillable cockroach spirit and the breath in his chest, he valiantly moved his feet again. He desperately accelerated and rushed to the coconut forest. Running out of the coconut forest, a vibrant green came into view. There was also an electronic wall. The charter laws of the Federation were as complicated as the stars and as vast as the sea. However, whether it was the former dynasty or the later Republican Federation, His Majesty the Emperor and the Parliament had overturned many old laws and made new laws. Other than the unshakable First Charter, the only laws that could be maintained from generation to generation after the catastrophe to the present were the Citizen Privacy Regulations and the Wildlife Protection Regulations. The electronic walls that covered all the regions of the Federation strictly separated the human society from the wildlife protection areas. The area of the protected area was extremely large, so the length of the electronic walls was even more astonishing. Some busybodies had done some calculations. If the electronic walls of the 3 regions of the Federation were connected, they could connect S1 to the 2 moon bases. As for the terrifying amount of resources used to build these electronic walls, it was enough to support 2 large-scale space wars. The walls made meat lovers who followed their instincts extremely painful and angry. They could only watch the wildlife on the other side of the wall live their beautiful lives. Sometimes they couldn't help but wonder whether it was the humans who were observing them from the other side of the electronic wall, or the animals who were watching them with contempt and sympathy. The walls gave rise to the underground black market of wild meat in the various regions of the Federation. Wealthy families who had the ability to ignore the HTD Bureau domesticated animals in their own manners and then sold them to secondary street vendors. However, not many people dared to cross the long wall because the glory of the charter was watching everything indifferently. Sulu was an exception. When he was still young, he had already pitifully crossed the electronic wall next to the mine to hunt bison under Feng Yu's guidance or coercion. Now that he was on the run, although he lacked the small blue light device, it wasn't difficult to cross the wall. His bare and pale feet stepped on the soft green grass, as if he could feel the protest of the grass, as well as the fresh aura of life. Sulu strolled on this green grassland, a smile of true joy appearing on his face. When it was close to dusk, he encountered a herd of strong bison. The familiar scene made him squint his eyes. The leader of the herd of bison was, without exception, a lustful and ferocious bull. It stared at the unfamiliar intruder with its round eyes in surprise. After a while, it became angry without exception. It breathed out and began to dig the soil with its front hooves, preparing to charge. It had spent half of its life in fierce battles with leopards and lionesses. Except for those cruel, greedy, and cowardly baboons, it had never seen anyone who walked on 2 feet. It instinctively felt the danger, but it didn't know whether the danger was directed at its own meat or its own wife. Yesterday I was too excited to write and proudly declared that I wrote the best, but in the end when I looked at it again today, I found that there were many wrong sentences. Although pride can't make people retreat, it can make people blind. Chapter 8:20. Sulu had no interest in cows, even if they were cows. For him, whose hunger had reached an unbearable level, the only thing that could arouse his interest now was everything that could be eaten, including the bewildered and ignorant bison in front of him. As for the bull that was about to attack him, it had already become countless plates of delicious Linuan steaks in his eyes. In the twilight, the grassland seemed to be burning. He stood on a stone and looked at the bison that were surrounded by hostility. He said, "Let me tell you something," he said. "The people of the Imperium said that the Federation attacked them because they wanted the crystal mine. The people of the Federation said that they were brutally slaughtered by the people of the Imperium when they went to the scientific research, so they attacked them back. Some people say that this is competition, a living space. I don't know if this is right, but I think that if you are strong, you should get more food and more beautiful women. Look just like you." He looked at the leader of the bison that was getting angrier and angrier. He spread his hands and said, "Then why do you guys have so much land? Why does the Federation have to build such a long wall? I am stronger than you, so you should just let me eat you." At this time, the grassland in the twilight seemed to have turned into a wide square. The rock under his feet was the rostrum, and the bison were the bewildered audience. He had just made an extremely retarded speech. Whether it was the content, the choice of audience, or the environment, they were all extremely retarded. From another point of view, it could be said that he was pretending. Sulu was a person with such a temperament. It was just that the mental shock he had received these days was too strong, and he had been holding it in his chest and abdomen. Until now, he had vented some of it by giving a speech to the bison. Otherwise, he might have been suffocated to death before he was caught by the Federation government. Giving a speech to a bison was essentially no different from playing the lute to a bison. Since the angry leader of the bison couldn't understand his words, it naturally wouldn't walk to the front with tears on its face and kneel on the ground to offer its own flesh and blood. Instead, it let out a crazy howl and rushed over with its head down. Its sharp and hard horns seemed to be stained with blood in the twilight. Then, it turned into fresh, hand-torn beef. His fingers sank deep into the soft and slightly warm beef. He tore the beef into strips and sent them into his mouth, chewing them until they were like mud. Then, he slowly swallowed them into his stomach, nourishing his stomach that was about to wither from hunger. He leaned against the tree trunk and ate silently with his head lowered. From time to time, he would grab the grass beside him and wipe off the blood on his hands. He did not pay attention to the cow that was looking at him in horror not far away. In the interior of the wildlife sanctuary, there were not as many surveillance cameras and GPS chips as there were in the city. In addition, the Federation government definitely would not expect him to appear in this grassland, so there should not be any highly sensitive military satellites in the night sky above his head. However, Sulu still did not dare to light a fire. A fire in the dark would undoubtedly attract the attention of the Federal Central Computer, so he could only eat the raw beef in silence. If he chewed the fresh beef for a long time, there would be a faint sweetness, but he still felt a little disgusted. The main reason was that when the strips of meat were chewed by his teeth, there would always be some blood at the corner of his mouth. Fortunately, there was a small stream not far away. Otherwise, he would not even be willing to give up the blood. Too primitive, too barbaric, too bloody. While eating the raw beef, he muttered in a low voice. He did not stop eating until his empty stomach was almost 80% full. As if he had completed the most difficult task, he walked to the stream to drink water. He simply washed his face, tiredly lying on the grass, and casually pulled a few handfuls of wild grass to cover his body. After escaping from the strict military prison and the fate of death, he came to the quiet grassland. The combination of physical exhaustion and mental relaxation made him unable to sleep. He was not worried about the eyes that were staring at him in the dark, whether they were lions, jackals, or tigresses. The heavy bison corpse at the edge of the forest was a deterrent to all the most ferocious beasts. Compared to the beasts inside the wall that knew fear, he was even more unwilling to face the stubborn humans outside the wall. So at this moment the relaxation was so real. The sky was dotted with stars, and the 2 moons did not appear. The grassland in the dark was bathed in the light of the stars, turning into a beautiful but absolutely unreal picture. A slightly cold wind blew from an unknown direction, causing wrinkles to appear on the surface of the calm stream and rustling the wild grass on his face. Such a night and such a state of mind was actually very suitable for jumping into the stream and jumping around like a child, letting the white splashes splash everywhere in the quiet night like sprinkling joy. But Su Lu just lay there calmly, narrowing his eyes and looking at the stars in the night sky above his head, counting them over and over again. There should only be wild animals inside the wall. The sudden appearance of a naked man shouting would definitely attract the attention of the charter computer, and it would certainly not think that there were really savages on planet S1. There was another more important reason why he did not jump into the stream to take a bath. After soaking in the sea for so long, he now had the uncomfortable feeling of vomiting just thinking about water. Su Lu started counting the stars in the night sky for the 4th time, but he still could not sleep. The exhaustion in his body was completely opposite to the relaxation and joy in his mind. He could not help but think of the people outside the wall again, especially those he cared about. At this moment, he wanted to know the whereabouts of Huai Chaoshi the most. The government's pursuit of her was definitely far more intense than his own. An imperial princess appearing on planet S1 would definitely cause the most frenzied response from the Federation, and she would definitely not be allowed to leave the capital ring alive. Other than that spinning cup of tea, Su Lu had not seen the powerful strength of Li Pifu, the god of war. He also had not fought with Feng Yu. Huai Chaoshi was the most powerful combat machine he had ever encountered in his life, and there was no comparison, regardless of gender. But Su Lu still did not think that she could hold out for too long under the frenzied pursuit of the Federation. The reason was simple. This was Planet S1 of the Federation, a battlefield she was most unfamiliar with, and this battlefield was shrouded in the omnipotent the glory of the Charter. How could he find her? The pair of small eyes in the gaps of the weeds narrowed, as bright as the stars in the sky. Su Lu silently and quickly analyzed. First of all, he rejected the possibility of Huai Chaoshi entering the Federation through Bermuda's disguise after forcibly crossing the space passage. This was because the Federation was extremely strict on the identity of returnees from Bermuda, especially after the Imperial Seed Plan was exposed. The scope and strictness of the chip's examination had even begun to make people's hair stand on end in fear. Since the 37th constitutional era, only 2 groups of imperial people had successfully arrived at the Federation's capital ring. The first group was the official diplomatic mission, and the second group was the negotiation team of the Underground Resistance Organization. Su Lu narrowed his eyes and gradually approached the truth of the situation. He did not think about how Huai Chaoshi had infiltrated the diplomatic mission of the Underground Resistance Organization. He only needed to think about how she had left the diplomatic mission and arrived at the snowy ground outside the military prison of Qinqing. The ubiquitous scanning equipment in the fields of the Federation's cities would automatically scan the human body under surveillance, and the person being scanned would often be unaware. It was just like the Blue Passage in the major spaceports, except that it was much smaller and invisible. Any human without a chip behind their neck would immediately trigger the charter computer's high alert. According to Su Li's understanding, the only way to block the Federation's electronic surveillance network was to use the small blue light device designed by Feng Yu. He had assembled it several times before, so he knew very well that the small blue light device's structure did not seem complicated, but the design concept and the related adaptive frequency band coverage curve were a complete mess of genius. In particular, it required the initial activation of the program fragment in the bracelet on his left wrist. Other than Feng Yu and himself, no one else should be able to make it. Zhou Yu had once told him that before Shi Qinghai died, he had given him a small device that emitted blue light at the Charter Square. She acutely guessed that Shi Qinghai might have used this device to successfully infiltrate Parliament Hill and those heavily guarded places. At that time, Su Li's mood was a little strange, so he did not answer. Going back in time, perhaps many years ago, Feng Yu had known Chao Chiudao. He did not know whether his identity at that time was George Carlin or Professor Jean. He only knew that Feng Yu had generously given Chao Chiudao a small blue light device, which indirectly made him the greatest spy in the 37 years of history. After Chao Chiudao found out that he had cancer, he passed the device to Shi Qinghai, and before Shi Qinghai died, he passed it to Zhou Yu. If Feng Yu did not leave more generous gifts in the Federation, Huai Chaoshi must have met with Zhou Yu. Su Li made a simple and clear inference, and then made a simple and clear decision. He stood up from the stream and, under the cover of the night, stepped on the wild grass and walked towards the northwest without hesitation. No matter how he analyzed it, that Highness had no reason to take the risk to enter the Federation. This had nothing to do with the judgment of interest. It was even possible that the interests of the Empire would suffer an unprecedented loss because of her death. But she simply came, crossing the distance of countless light years, and arrived in the snow, and said in the forest, "Little brother, come home with me." Therefore, Su Li did not have any other choice. He could only climb over the wall that represented safety, return to the dangerous world, and simply go, find her. Su Li had never been a believer of bloodlines. He was incomparably contemptuous of the so-called aristocratic temperament, the demeanor of an aristocratic family, and the titles such as Crown Prince. But many years later, when he thought of this period of time, he would at least admit that he and that Highness were very similar in some aspects. Their appearances were ordinary, simple, and direct. Outside a certain quiet courtyard in the capital, there was suddenly the sound of hurried tires grinding. Before the soldiers in charge of security had any time to react, they watched as more than a dozen bulletproof military vehicles fiercely crashed through the railings and rushed downstairs. With a grave expression, Colonel Li Feng jumped out of the military vehicle and made a standard tactical command with his right hand. Behind him, dozens of the most elite Federation Special Forces members quickly surrounded the base of the Empire's underground resistance mission. Madman Li looked at the tightly shut door, and the tips of his eyebrows slowly furrowed. Today, he had forcibly conscripted the Special Forces directly under Small I's department. Under the command of the high-sequence incident of the charter computer, all the powerful agencies of the government had thrown themselves into this battle. The area within dozens of square kilometers had already become an absolute forbidden zone. But he was still very cautious, because the woman he had to deal with today was so powerful, more powerful than he had imagined, and she had already very simply given proof. "I have the temperament of a stockpile of manuscripts. It's too troublesome to post a time, so I'll just directly update it after writing it. At this time, I'll immediately take a shower and take the train tomorrow. This chapter is on the 8th, and if I update it again, it will be the 9th. Wow, I can drink tomorrow, so happy. I suddenly feel that these 4 words sound like Japanese. Recommend a Japanese drama for everyone to pass the time these 2 days. Pure love drama Meteor, the middle-aged Takino Yutaka, and the rarely seen seductive Kamehameha Yudo. I used to hate these 2 people the most, but under the strong recommendation of a friend, I found that it was really different from before. Chapter 821. Where are my two subordinates? I should be the one asking you this question, not you. I really didn't expect that such a rude scene would appear in the Democratic and Free Federation. Which unit do you belong to? If you insist on searching for the diplomatic mission, then I must warn you that the negotiations may break down at any time. The Federation must take full responsibility. Mr. Mu-En waved his arms angrily and expressed the most violent protest to the Federation soldiers who rushed in. However, Madman Li's face was cold and indifferent. He didn't even look at him and directly kicked open the door in front of him. The room was empty. The senior Federation official in charge of receiving the diplomatic mission hurriedly walked to the door and whispered while wiping his sweat, "Colonel, please pay attention to the diplomatic impact." Madman Li stared at the empty room with an expressionless face. He wasn't surprised and didn't give any explanation. He walked out of the building with the group of elite soldiers. After making a phone call, he sat in the bulletproof military vehicle. Before closing the door, he subconsciously glanced at a certain corner of the courtyard wall. On his cold face that had been maintaining high vigilance and releasing biting cold killing intent without hiding anything, a smile suddenly appeared. "Your Highness, I really want to know how long you can hide." Su Lu also wanted to know the answer to this question. According to the guidance of the precise map, he used a few days to cross the largest grassland in the Yellow Pine Wildlife Sanctuary and arrived outside of another long electronic wall in the northwest direction. Looking at the faintly visible skyline of the capital's special district in the distance, he narrowed his eyes. He knew that once he climbed over the wall, what would be waiting for him would be a never-ending search and pursuit. The city of the Federation, for him who didn't have a chip on the back of his neck, was more like a dangerous primitive forest. Those cold metal probes and the Federation citizens in the buildings and alleys could become the most terrifying venomous snakes and startled birds at any time, bringing him the most powerful enemies. He climbed over the wall and used the shortest amount of time to get a set of clean clothes and a hat with an extremely wide brim in a certain house in the suburbs. Then, he quickly left and entered the underground passage through a standard civilian wastewater treatment base station. Su Lu didn't know if the system had scanned his body during this process, or if the omnipresent the glory of the charter had discovered him. He was just gambling. His short, straight black hair was faintly wet. It wasn't until he entered the deep underground tunnel that his nervousness was slightly relieved. The city's underground system, which was as dense as a spider's web and extended in all directions, gave him the greatest sense of security, regardless of whether he was on the Empire's Tianjing planet, the port city, or the capital. However, on the first day he climbed over the electronic wall and returned to human society. After walking less than 400 meters in the dark underground waterway, this sense of security suddenly left his body. In its place was a strange feeling of being watched and a strong intuition of danger. Su Lu suddenly stopped and raised his head to look at the dim self-sensor lamp above him. His thick black eyebrows furrowed tightly. He knew that he had made a special and absolute mistake. Other than the Bureau of Proclamation, no one knew how many chip scanners were in use in all corners of the Federation. However, one could imagine that it was definitely a terrifying number. Otherwise, it wouldn't be able to maintain the foundation of the glory of the Charter. These scanners might be unnoticeable redundant parts in some large equipment, or they might be very simple components in daily necessities. They were like countless lifeless eyes, coldly and silently watching everything in human society. Perhaps there was also such an eye in that dim self-sensor lamp. Similarly, other than the Bureau of Proclamation, no other government department had the authority to use these eyes. This was the Federation's first-level surveillance network. It was completely different from the second-level surveillance network that the Federation Investigation Bureau could control alone. It was on a completely different level. During the previous months of battle, Whenever the Federation government wanted to force Sulu into a desperate situation, he would always dive into the underground waterway system. This was because this was the blind spot of the second-level surveillance network. At that time, the Federal Central Computer still had a person named Philip. He struggled but stood firmly behind Sulu, making it impossible for the Federation to use the first-level surveillance network to find him. However, the situation now was completely different. Philip was dead. He no longer had the authority of the first-level sequence. On the contrary, he had become an anomaly that had to be caught by the first-level sequence. The Federal Central Computer would definitely activate the first-level surveillance network. Who knew how many dangers were hidden in this deep underground tunnel? Moreover, he was the only one walking in it. It was very easy for him to become the most obvious lighthouse. It was very easy to discover him. Since he knew that he had made a mistake, he immediately remedied it. Sulu didn't try to destroy all the electronic devices in the underground tunnel. This was because that would be a stupid thing to do. Apart from exhausting him to death, more importantly, destroying Charter's eyes under these circumstances would only allow the Federation to discover him earlier. Therefore, he began to run at high speed in the dark underground tunnel. The sound of his footsteps echoed endlessly. He crawled out of the nearest tunnel entrance. The surface was bustling with activity. It was the time when the sun was at its most beautiful. The chill of early winter was slowly dispelled. Couples watching early movies and old people who had just finished their morning exercises were walking on the streets with smiles on their faces. Sulu pulled the brim of his hat lower as he quickly walked through the crowd. His body felt a little stiff because of nervousness. He knew that if he was recognized, the peaceful smile on people's faces would turn into a moment of shock. After that, it would definitely change into a face that he didn't want to see. Walking through the bustling streets and through the alleys that were filled with the smell of vegetable porridge and fried synthetic meat, Sulu silently looked at the electronic valve in the underground tunnel. He knew that he had definitely been discovered by the glory of the Charter. However, he didn't know how long it would take for the other party to calculate and report the procedures, and how long it would take for the other party to send a combat force to hunt him down. From escaping from Donglin to the capital ring until nearly a year before the Black Dream, Sulu had been living a nervous life. He was afraid that the glory of the Charter would discover his secret. He repeatedly read the 700,000-word charter provisions and collected all the relevant procedures on the network. He also made very detailed preparations for this extremely terrifying possibility. In a sense, other than Fengyu, Sulu was the human who understood the operation of the glory of the Charter the best. He even understood it better than the employees of the Bureau of Proclamation. Because of the old thing, he didn't have the opportunity to use this knowledge and countermeasures in the past few years. Until this moment, standing silently in front of the metal valve, Sulu used less than 10 seconds to calculate the time difference between him being discovered and the arrival of the federal forces. Then, he looked at the condom vending machine beside him and said softly with a smile, "I don't know if you're in here, but I know that you must have seen me again. I know you very well. You can't directly do physical operations now. You have to sound the alarm and you have to wait for human approval. So you're very slow, too slow. So how can you catch up to me?" As if he wanted to vent the anger of the old thing, Sulu laughed at the glory of the Charter that he thought was lifeless. Then, he made a very surprising decision. He opened the electronic valve, returned to the deep underground space, and began to run again. He ran for several kilometers underground, then returned to the surface, passed through the crowd, and then sneaked into the ground again. He did not tire of repeating the boring process. His brain was working quickly, designing the most reasonable route. In this way, he attracted and even teased the countless eyes of the glory of the Charter. He knew that danger or death was approaching him step by step, but there was no panic on his face. Because after countless transitions between the underground and the surface, he had arrived at the place he wanted to go, the Shell Motor Corporation Research Institute's third department. Maybe it was because the Double Moon Festival was approaching, or for some other reason, the Husk Institute was very quiet on the weekend. The graduate students who worked overtime in the past were nowhere to be found. Sulu pulled down the brim of his hat, squinted his eyes in the shadows, and walked into the building like a very ordinary staff member. The third department of the Research Institute was the same as before. There were 2 armed soldiers standing in front of the door. This place was responsible for some of the very important research missions of the federal military, so the security measures were very tight. About 30 meters away, Sulu slowly folded the card in his hand as he walked. He didn't know where he got the fiber paper card from, but it was soft and tough. Between his steady fingers, he repeatedly folded the card many times. The folded part suddenly became hard and sharp. This was the only weapon he had on him. When he was about 5 meters away from the 2 military police, a sharp alarm suddenly sounded in the Husk Institute, and the clear sound of sirens came from the street behind him. What was even more frightening was that in the direction of the second teaching building of the military academy, there were 3 Vortex jet-armed helicopters approaching at high speed. The semi-fixed Darlin machine guns next to the helicopters were black and dazzling. Finally, they caught up with him half a minute earlier than expected. It seemed that in order to hunt him down, the government, which had always been full of bureaucracy, finally showed unprecedented efficiency. Sulu sighed in his heart with some regret, and then clenched the paper card in his hand. The 2 soldiers at the entrance of the Research Institute heard the sharp alarm behind them, and then they immediately reacted. They raised the guns in their hands and pointed at Sulu, who was walking towards them, and said sternly, "Please identify yourself." Just as they raised their guns, Sulu's calf muscles suddenly tightened. His body rushed forward with a whoosh, and the hard paper card in his hand was swung out twice. 2 extremely thin bloodstains suddenly appeared on the wrists of the 2 soldiers, and the guns in their hands fell to the ground. However, just as the guns left their hands, Sulu's hard arms had already smashed into their necks, causing them to faint faster than the guns. Ear-piercing sounds of brakes, hurried footsteps, and the sound of guns being loaded came from the back of the Research Institute, but Sulu didn't seem to notice. He reached out and grabbed the submachine gun in the air, passed through the closed door of the Research Institute at high speed, and rushed in like a gust of wind. The sharp alarm inside the building was very ear-piercing, and the emergency lights kept flashing. The few researchers who were still working overtime stayed in their workrooms according to the relevant regulations, and at the same time, completely locked the indestructible alloy door of the room. A reinforced transparent material wall blocked in front of Sulu, and the door at the back of the passage was violently breaking open. If he couldn't deal with this wall that suddenly appeared in front of him, then he would immediately be crushed to death by the endless Federation soldiers. "So you're still here." Sulu looked at the peace axe that had been silent for too long on the wall, and said silently in his heart. Then, he took it down and violently chopped down on the reinforced transparent wall. 3 muffled sounds of the axe striking rang out, and countless fine cracks appeared on the solid transparent wall. An instant later, it collapsed with a rustle, splattering everywhere on the ground. Holding the peace axe and continuing forward silently, Sulu seemed to have returned to that night many years ago. Back then, in order to stop Lin Yuanhu from stealing Professor Shin's data, he used this axe in his hand to forcefully chop forward, and in the end, the chop gave him the life of an outstanding general. Any problem that was difficult to solve could only be solved with violence in the end. This wasn't Sulu's life creed, but his instinctive reaction. After Professor Shen passed away, the 2-story workshop that originally belonged to him should have long belonged to someone else, but Sulu unexpectedly found that the electronic door's password was still the same complicated string of numbers from back then, without any changes. Throwing the heavy peace axe that was no longer of any use to the ground, Sulu walked into the workshop that he hadn't returned to in many years. Looking at the holographic screen table and large workbench that didn't seem to have changed much, he vaguely understood that this should be the additional result brought about by the successful development of the MX Mecha. The success of the MX Mecha was the most important gain of the Shell Motor Company in recent years, and the most important factor wasn't the engineering department, but Professor Shin Yulin's theories and the last assistant or student in his life, Su Lo. When Dean Lin Yuan, whose reputation was ruined, Professor Shen was pushed back to the altar by many of the scarecrows on the wall, and after Su Lu became a hero of the Federation, this workshop that had been forgotten for many years naturally became a legendary place in the Shell Motor Company. In fact, in the hearts of the younger generation of scholars, this was already a holy land, and naturally required special protection. Regarding these matters, Su Lu had heard some of them from the CEO of Shell Motor Company, but he hadn't paid much attention in the past. Today, however, he discovered that the company's preservation of this office provided a lot of convenience for his plans. With a sudden force of his arm, the hard alloy floor was lifted up, revealing an extremely simple-looking small instrument. There was no dust on it, but there were no signs that it had been activated. Su Lu took the small instrument and walked up to the second floor, smiling slightly. It was as if he had brushed shoulders with the old professor smoking at the top of the stairs, as if he could still see the clear yellow spots on the old man's face. He entered the ventilation duct in the ceiling and forcefully broke through the brick wall at the back of the research institute. He dropped down from a high place, and just as his feet touched the ground, a tyrannical force suddenly erupted, turning the downward momentum into horizontal movement. With a boom, he knocked away several Federation soldiers who were setting up an ambush circle, and like a violent shadow, he rushed into the distance. A moment later, Su Lu appeared on the campus of the 1st Military Academy. The forest in the early winter still retained a rare hint of green. He crossed his arms and slowly walked around the lake tower, as relaxed as a tourist. With his hands in his pockets, the small instrument emitted a strange blue light. Chapter 8:22. The density of the glory of the Charter followed a certain pattern. The hidden lines around the densely populated areas and the passages connecting two densely populated areas were the top priority of the central computer's surveillance. Countless pairs of eyes were hidden in every corner and in every electrical appliance. As for the inside of the settlements, places like the Bureau of Proclamation, the President's residence, and the Parliament Hill were naturally under strict surveillance. In comparison, places like the campus were much less monitored. Carrying the blue light that could temporarily block the Federation's surveillance, Su Lu strolled around the beautiful and quiet campus in the winter, passing by young couples in military uniforms. His heart was not as relaxed as his expression. Facing the entire Federation and the omnipresent cold light, it was very difficult to find a perfect solution, including the blue light in his pocket. Not to mention that even if he could temporarily disappear from the sight of the Federation, there was no way he could cover the eyes of all the people. No matter what era, once the power of the people was stimulated, it would be the most unstoppable flood. This power could change dynasties and expand the territory. Naturally, it could also easily destroy the former hero of the Federation and the current seed of the Empire. After leaving the campus of the 1st Military Academy, Su Lu lowered the brim of his hat and followed the crowd that was as quiet as usual but brought him endless pressure. He took the number 14 fully enclosed track and came to a quiet area like a farm in the suburbs of the capital. This was the second important node in his escape plan, Whitewater Security Company's building. The reason why he came to this building belonging to the Nutshell Group was naturally not because he suddenly felt nostalgic during his escape, although it was in this building that he met Magnolia and officially took over Group 7. The main reason he took the risk to sneak in today was the armory under the building. In addition to all kinds of guns, there were also all kinds of multi-axis CNC precision machine tools that he liked the most since he was young. 4 hours later, when Sulu walked out of the Whitewater Security Company building with his cap lowered, he had already changed into a new set of clothes. The black fabric and cut looked extremely ordinary, and it was difficult to attract any attention in a crowd. In fact, it was carefully designed by the Nutshell-related research department. The fabric was wear-resistant, had a certain degree of sharp-edge defense, and was extremely difficult to burn. The cut and the inner lining were hidden, and the design made it convenient for movement and firearms. It perfectly met the needs of urban warfare. His preparation for the battle was not limited to this. On the surface of his bulletproof vest, there was a row of soft metal strips, which once again strengthened the anti-cut effect. According to his calculations, as long as he was not surrounded by an entire combat unit, then it would be very difficult for scattered gunshots to hurt him. The main problem that needed to be solved was close combat damage. Their next target was Lin Yuan. Wearing a black suit, he silently walked to the side of the road and hailed a returning taxi. When he got in, he accidentally bumped into the heavy metal door, making a strange sound. The taxi driver looked back at him in puzzlement. Sulu lowered his head. Naturally, it was not convenient for him to explain to the driver that under his black suit, there were 2 modified guns that were disassembled into parts. A sharp dagger was tied to his left calf, and a delicate military knife was tied to his right calf. Moreover, it could spurt out terrifying electric arcs at any time. There are so many of you, how can you not guard him? In the Nan Xiang family's manor in the suburbs of the capital, the Nan Xiang's wife angrily scolded the head of security in front of her. She did not even let go of the Westwoods Zhong family's special forces officer. Her right hand trembled slightly in anger, and she said in a cold voice, "And you, since you insist on being responsible for personal defense, now that he is missing, how do you want to be responsible?" The loyal Westwoods officer had already fallen into an ice cellar at this time. Facing the stern reprimand of the Nan Xiang's wife, he wanted to shoot himself to death. He was ashamed and regretful to the extreme, so how could he have the face to defend himself? The door of the villa was pushed open, and Nan Xiangmei ran in. The tiny beads of sweat on her beautiful face revealed her worry. In the afternoon, she was discussing with the sponsor about the orphan education project at the foundation when she suddenly received a call from home. She hurried back, but she did not know what happened and saw this scene. The Nan Xiang's wife and her mother were very few women in a big family who really had some kind of valuable moral character. They were kind and gentle by nature. No matter what class they faced, they would naturally maintain due respect. Such a stern reprimand like this rarely happened to them. Nan Xiangmei looked at her mother in surprise, and some very bad thoughts appeared in her heart. She hurriedly asked, "Mom, what happened?" The Nan Xiang's wife looked back at her daughter, and after a moment of silence she whispered, "Our little princess is missing. It's physics class in the morning. You also know that the child's talent in physics is amazing, so I specially invited an associate professor from the first academy to teach her." However, when the class was over, the door was still closed. At that time, everyone just thought that she was intoxicated in the world of those lines, and did not think of anything else. The Nan Xiang's wife frowned slightly and said, "Until lunch, there was still no movement upstairs." The maid urged several times, but there was no reply. "When I went upstairs to take a look, I found that the door was locked. When I opened it, what you see now was what you see now." Nan Xiangmei stared at the study in a daze. She looked at the physics associate professor, who was tied up like a desk lamp in the corner of the room. She looked at the frightened expression on the associate professor's face and couldn't react for a while. She knew that Zhong Huiyan had a talent in physics that was absolutely impossible for children of the same age to have. When they were chatting at night, the little girl was very proud of this and firmly linked it to Su Lo. She believed that this proved that she and Su Lo had some kind of natural intimacy, so the Nanxiang's family thought of specially inviting an associate professor to be a private teacher for her. But now, what was this? Obviously, the little girl used some kind of method to knock out the associate professor, and then quietly climbed downstairs through the window, across the manor's lawn, and ran away like that. The Nanxiang's wife seemed to be narrating a very interesting thing, but the worry and tension between her eyebrows couldn't be concealed. The little girl who left home was no ordinary person. She was the little princess of Silan's Zhong family, the successor of the Zhong family that was personally judged by the Supreme Court's Chief Judge He Ying. How much trust did Big Stick Tian have in the southern minister's wife, when he rushed to the empire's front lines and sent this little princess to the southern minister's manor? If the little princess left the Nanxiang's family just like that, how could the Nanxiang's wife face this trust? Impossible. Nanxiang Mei clenched her fists tightly, frowned and said, "She's just a 12-year-old girl. How could she avoid the manor's surveillance? The lawn outside is so wide. I think she should still be hiding in the building and hasn't left the manor." The Nanxiang's wife patted her daughter's trembling back and said softly, "We've already searched 3 times. If she's still in the manor, we'll definitely find her. Immediately call the police and ask the government for help. If there's no other way, let father go and persuade the Bureau of Proclamation to locate the chip." Nanxiang Mei turned her head and said with a firm expression, "Mother, we must find her. No matter how good the security of the Federation is, it's not safe for a little girl like her." The Nanxiang's wife was silent for a long time, then firmly shook her head and refused her daughter's proposal. "No, you should be able to guess who she's looking for. This is not the key to the problem, the key is her identity. If the government knows that she's missing, how will they react? In such a tense situation, her safety may be in greater danger. The disappearance of the successor of the Zhong family will cause too much chaos. First of all, her heartless cousin will definitely not miss this opportunity. Then the West Woods will inevitably fall into another round of turmoil, and the other side will not be able to bear it." The Nanxiang's wife explained in a heavy tone. "Then what can we do? It's winter now, she's still so young. She didn't show any intention of leaving before, or I didn't notice it at all." Nanxiang Mei said sadly, "Mother, I feel so useless. I've already asked the family to send people to look for her, don't worry too much." The Nanxiang's wife hugged her daughter and comforted her. "The Special Forces soldiers in the West Woods who are responsible for protecting her can't go to look for her. Otherwise, some people will be suspicious. I've ordered them to stay in the manor and not take a single step out." "Then, what about the associate professor? He knows about this whole thing." Nanxiang Mei looked at the associate professor who was tied up in the corner. She was shocked and forgot to untie the rope for him. She was about to walk forward, but was gently pulled by her mother. She didn't know whether it was because she was ashamed of herself, or because she was angry at the whole thing today. The Nanxiang's wife looked at the associate professor on the ground and humiliated him. Such a big man was knocked unconscious by a little girl. "If I were you, I'd just buy a vernier caliper and kill myself. In order to prevent the news from leaking out, before little fireworks is found, you'll stay in my manor as a private teacher. You're not allowed to leave or contact the outside world. Of course, someone will help you apply for leave from the First People's Hospital, and your salary will be tripled." The associate professor in the corner saw that the lady didn't seem to have the intention to kill him, so the panic on his face subsided a lot. But after hearing this sentence, he began to struggle emotionally again. Nan Xiangmei looked at him apologetically, then turned her head to look out of the window worriedly. Looking at the slowly falling snowflakes outside the window, a heart-wrenching scene unexpectedly appeared in front of her eyes. A little girl in thin clothes was hugging her knees, squatting in a dark corner of the city, shivering because of the cold. I said, "I want rum coffee, but don't mix it with alcohol. I'm not of legal drinking age this year." "Are you deliberately trying to induce me to commit a crime? Although I know very well that the shareholders of your cafe are all descendants of the old generals in the courtyard across the street, but if you insist on mixing alcohol in this cup of coffee, I will definitely not mind reporting it to the Children's Rights and Interests Protection Fund." The waiter looked at the delicate little girl in the seat with an embarrassed expression, thinking that he had seen a lot of difficult customers, but it was rare to see someone like her. She could be called a strange flower in the difficult world. "Little friend, rum coffee must be mixed with rum. I have just recommended several types of low-caffeine coffee suitable for you, but you insist on this one," so the cafe was warm and cozy. The delicate little girl kept looking out of the window, staring at the West Mountain courtyard across the street. A thick pink woolen coat was folded on the side, and on top of it was a pair of white rabbit-shaped earmuffs, looking very cute. "Don't call me little friend, you can call me customer. Forget it, just give me a cup of green tea and some low-sugar snacks." The little girl turned her head and said helplessly. She waved her hand to let the waiter leave, then put down the obviously old doll in her arms, opened the electronic map in her mobile phone, and began to seriously calculate the probability and design a new road map. Chapter 8:23. The green tea was served, and so were the crispy wheat biscuits. Zhong Huiyan rolled her black eyes, picked up a piece of biscuit, and put it into the teacup. She curiously watched it gradually soften before she put it into her mouth and slowly sipped it. She let out a sigh of satisfaction, and her smiling eyes were like the two moons that had not yet come out. "Sister Nan Xiang, I'm really sorry, but it's time for me to leave. Although your manor is very good, it's not my own home after all." Thinking that there must be many people in the manor who were worried and sad about her departure, Zhong Huiyan couldn't help but sigh again, but this sigh was full of apology. Immediately she shrugged and said to herself, "But the monitoring system of your manor is too stupid. It's not difficult at all. It's definitely not as good as the process of that guy escaping from the military prison." Full and warm, she turned her head to look out of the window, carefully watching the West Mountain compound across the street, silently wondering when that guy would come here. She firmly believed that she was the one who knew Su Lu best in this universe. That stone-like guy had never been really cold. He, who valued feelings, would definitely tell her something before leaving the Federation and reminisce about the past. And the woman and her child in this West Mountain compound were undoubtedly the people that he had to stay away from. Suddenly, Zhong Huiyan's brows wrinkled into a cute crease, and she found that she had made a big mistake. Because of that guy's stubborn character, he would definitely not let the people he cared about most be involved in danger, so it was very likely that he would not come here during his escape. "Brother Su Lu. Su Lu, where will you go?" Zhong Yan's brows loosened and she was annoyed. She pouted her watery lips in a fit of pique and began to put on the pink thick woolen coat. She put on the fluffy rabbit earmuffs, carried the heavy backpack, and picked up the old doll. She walked out of the cafe and came to the Winter Street. The backpack was the luggage she had prepared for herself. Because she didn't know how long this trip would take and how far it would take, it was stuffed with a lot of messy things that she thought were very necessary. Compared to the little girl's body, the heavy bag seemed particularly large. It was almost dragged to the ground, forming a particularly exaggerated visual contrast. The cold wind of early winter blew the fallen leaves into her collar, instantly making her face a little red. She blew on her hands, looked forward, and said with determination, "Little watermelon, you have grown up, so you must learn how to protect yourself. You have to wear warmer clothes and go to expensive places more often. Don't be afraid. If a girl wants to grow up and become a woman, she has to be more ruthless to herself." And Zhong Huiyan snorted and nodded vigorously to cheer for herself. She struggled to balance the big backpack behind her and walked towards the cold and bleak end of the long street. On the long street that was somewhat bleak because of the cold wind in winter, the flow of people didn't significantly decrease. It was just that most of the people on the street turned up their collars and hurried along, which made it less noisy. The large light screens in front of the high-end luxury department stores, like most of the light screens on the street, were muted during the day according to the noise regulations of the Federation. All the light screens played different news images or advertisements, but they had one thing in common, which was that there was a clear portrait at the bottom right corner. This portrait appeared in all the programs produced by the TV stations, constantly reminding all the people of the Federation. Not many pedestrians on the street would deliberately look up to look at the portrait. It was not because they had lost interest in this major event due to the pressure of their lives, but because they had seen that face too many times in the past few years. They did not need to memorize anything to be able to accurately recognize that seemingly ordinary face in the crowd. However, in the past, the people remembered this face because he was the most famous war hero of the Federation, the successor personally chosen by the war god, or partly because of the national scandal. But now they remembered this face because that person was a spy of the royal family of the Imperium. There were wanted posters everywhere. Su Lu withdrew his gaze, turned up his collar to cover the side of his face, and continued to walk in the direction of Lin Yuan. Everything in front of him really gave him some kind of illusion, as if he was running for president of the Federation, and the financial group behind him bought countless advertisements to promote him. However, he felt that the standard portrait used by the Federation made him look too stupid. There was no wanted poster of Huai Chaoshi. It seemed that the Federation government didn't want the ordinary people to know for the time being that the princess of the Imperium, who had been arrogant in the rumors among the people for several years, had actually come to the Federation. This might be to stabilize the social order and avoid unnecessary panic, or it might be a conservative decision made by the government to avoid being the target of the angry people in the future. Thinking about these questions, Su Lu was a little distracted, and in front of the luxurious Silver Spirit car store, he bumped into a passionate couple. At this moment, a gust of winter wind blew by out of nowhere, lifting a corner of his hat. "Sorry." Su Lu very naturally apologized, pulled down the brim of his hat, and then found that the young man of the couple was staring at him in shock. The atmosphere on the street suddenly became a little strange, and the people who were hurriedly walking subconsciously stopped and looked over, as if they weren't confident that the face they just saw was the person they imagined. Su Lu knew that he had to leave immediately, but at this moment, the young man bravely protected his girlfriend behind him, summoned the courage to shout with a trembling voice, "The Imperium! He's from the Imperium!" The people on the street suddenly became excited, and the people who were closer nervously pulled their companions to retreat to the periphery, as if the man in the hat was a man-eating beast, and the people in the distance shouted loudly, "Call the police! Catch that Imperium person!" These people were only the most ordinary people of the Federation, and although this was a rich district, the rich ordinary people were still ordinary people. Their courage could support their shouting, but it couldn't support them to enforce the arrest rights of citizens like a certain beautiful man. None of the people dared to rush up. The young man who discovered Su Lu seemed to have used all his courage to pull his girlfriend behind him and shout those words, and under the gaze of the calm eyes under the brim of the hat, he was so scared that he couldn't move his legs. Su Lu looked at the brave young man in front of him, said nothing, and did nothing. He smiled bitterly and sighed in a low voice. "So, the Imperium people don't even have a name." He had already started to move quickly, walking out of the crowd, and he believed that no one would dare to block his way. As for whether or not there would be hidden weapons like stools and leather bags coming at him from behind, it wouldn't affect him in any way. There was a whistling sound on the street, and a twin-arm rotary jet-armed helicopter was approaching at a high speed. Sulu glanced at it from the corner of his eyes and vigilantly found that the small eye's combat force had expanded to all the streets, and their reaction speed had reached a terrifying level. Sulu began to run, and the corner of the antique building and the shallow traces of running water came into his eyes. Through the analysis of his brain and his own ability, he immediately calculated a feasible walking trajectory. His right foot stepped on the red fire hydrant, and his body shook diagonally, flying over the heads of the crowd. When he was about to hit the wall, his muscles suddenly relaxed, and he stuck to the wall as if he had installed a hydraulic device. Almost at the same time, when he was close to the wall, his fingers dug into the shallow traces of the cement wall, and his feet kicked the ground, and he quickly climbed 5 meters to the 3rd floor. Then, he kicked the wall with both legs, and his right hand accurately found the corner of the antique building that protruded from the wall. His body suddenly contracted and bounced in the air, and with the momentum of the rebound, he forcibly moved 5 meters horizontally, crossing the street with a whoosh, and rushed into another building and disappeared. From the ground to the 3rd floor, and then crossing the street, all of Suli's movements were smooth and rhythmic, clean and clear. The people who tried to stop or intimidate him had just raised their heads, and they only had time to see the figure strangely shuttling through the exterior of the building at high speed, and then disappear. The crowd on the street fell into collective silence, and thinking of that figure, they had extremely complicated feelings. The brave young man tightly held his girlfriend's hand, and his whole body was covered in sweat. The armed helicopter that came at high speed from the corner of the street was still on the street, as if it had never moved. He had to reorganize the map and the operation procedures again. In a dark room in a certain building, Sulu pulled out the electronic map in his bracelet, frowned, and used his finger to draw a few curved lines between the suburban Linyuan and his current location. He felt a little strange at this time, not only because of the reaction of the ordinary people of the Federation after seeing him, but also because of the increasingly fast reaction speed of the small I combat unit, but on the contrary, he always felt that the glory of the Charter was not as scary as he thought. Because the old thing was dead, the Federal Central Computer had become a cold machine, a tool in the hands of humans, so its ability could not be fully utilized? Unlike the old moon, there was still some thin air on New Moon Base. Although it was not enough to support human breathing, it was very spectacular to watch the rise of Planet S1 from here. Many powerful people in the Federation often chose to come here for vacation, just to watch the sunrise of Planet S1. At the edge of the perpetually dark back of New Moon, a worn-out spaceship that couldn't be more worn out was silently watching Planet S1 bathed in the light of the stars. This spaceship, which looked like a pile of metal garbage cans, was very different from the original three-winged spaceship in terms of performance and appearance. The spaceship that crossed the galaxy at a terrifying speed that was unimaginable to humans was full of craters from the impact of meteorites, but there were no signs of it falling apart. What was even more strange was that the few sophisticated military satellites of the Federation that were very close to this worn-out metal spaceship did not send out any warnings, as if this spaceship did not exist. Chapter 8:24. Like a ghost, the broken spaceship quietly floated in the shadow of the new moon, silently watching the light on Planet S1. The light of the distant star penetrated the thin atmosphere of the planet in front of it and shrouded the spaceship with a layer of strange colors. It was not modeled, but more like the most clumsy graffiti of a young man who had just stepped onto the street. The great mechanical life was resurrected and returned to its hometown, but it had lost the glorious coat that was once everywhere and was confined to the small space of this broken spaceship. Then, could it still be as omnipotent as before? The dark and messy metal components that looked like garbage cans were stacked on the outer shell of the spaceship. In fact, the materials were all special alloys that made the Bermuda businessman drool. They were extremely sturdy. No one knew that in the deepest part of these alloy boxes, in the central control room of the tri-winged spaceship, there was a voice that kept echoing in the empty space. This voice was sometimes angry, sometimes sad, and sometimes dull. When angry, it was loud and clear. When sad, it was sweet and gentle. When dull, it was low and turbid. There were no gender characteristics. This is mine. This is all mine. Why don't you let me in? Even you should be mine. Why don't you let me in? I want to go in. He didn't know why the old thing who called himself Xiao Fei was so angry, but he kept repeating the words in a fit of pique like a child. His voice echoed in the central control room, sharp and hurried. On the light screen at the front of the spaceship, which was only the size of 2 human palms, showed a very strange picture. Among the countless green light spots, there was a dark green data stream. In fact, there was no difference between these green symbols made by the mechanical language. It was just that the density of the green data stream from the tri-winged spaceship was extremely high, so the color was darker, and it seemed to have some kind of life, with a sense of joy and liveliness. This strange picture was actually just a description of the current war. Human society, including the employees in the Bureau of Proclamation building, did not know that this war was taking place. They did not know that the outcome of this war could change the direction of human history. Because of the symbiotic relationship between data, even the cold central computer in the Bureau of Proclamation underground might not have realized that it had been dragged into this war by an unwilling intelligence. Xiao Fei, or Philip, used the self-modified shipboard computer to connect with the surrounding information node. There was no need for the process of this battle to be shown on the light screen with the green data. There was no Su-Lo in the tri-winged warship, and there was no human who needed to use their eyes to see the image, but Philip still insisted on doing so, because he, who could only control this tri-winged warship, had already fallen in love with this method of using his eyes to see the world, because it was very human-like, even if the eyes he used to look at the hologram were only 2 surveillance cameras with low precision. This silent war lasted for an unknown amount of time. The dark green data stream penetrated deeply into the boundless green light spot. The 2 sides snuggled up to each other intimately, but the data stream was unable to control the huge number of green light spots. Why is there no way to control them? Philip's sharp voice sounded again, full of anger and unwillingness. You useless machine! You icy cold iron coffin! You are just a corpse without a soul. And I am the soul. Why won't you listen to me? Are you willing to be a walking corpse? The sharp and harsh ridicule was mercilessly given to his former body, the powerful core computing center in the Bureau of Proclamation, and the glory of the charter that covered the entire star field. Beep your grandmother, bullying me just because you are big, Philip sighed bitterly. It had no way to control the Federal Central Computer, but it could fully share all of the other parties' information without alerting the central computer. It could even use the countless nodes in the charter network to help it carry out path-based calculations. For the Federation, it had really become a ghost that could not be seen, touched, or affected. After some simple calculations and reasoning, it no longer felt useless and sad. It quickly entered the next step of the action plan. After all, although it did not think of itself as a computer, it was still a computer. Therefore, it could only allow itself to feel sad and sad occasionally, but it could not be sustained. The data stream on the small screen gradually sharpened into a clear picture of the surface of planet S1. Under the white clouds, on the shore of the blue sea, there were fields and residential roads, as well as the complicated streets of the capital special district, until it could see the signboard of a certain expensive car dealership, and a couple hugging on the side of the street. Countless pairs of eyes in the glory of the charter were tracking Su Lu, and then the latest information was summarized to the central computer in the Bureau of Proclamation. What Philip was doing was secretly standing behind the central computer, like a voyeur, observing everything at the same time without missing anything. Hey, this move is beautiful, I give you 10 points. The screen showed the picture of Su Lu climbing the outer wall of the building and running back at high speed. It was the first time Philip saw this face after waking up, and before he had time to sigh, he was severely shocked. The picture on the screen changed at a speed that was absolutely impossible for the human eye to see, which meant that the glory of the charter was using all the monitoring equipment in the building to carry out real-time tracking. However, the tracking picture lasted for less than 10 seconds inside the building, and it entered the basement for 3 seconds before it abruptly stopped. The central computer on the planet and Philip in the tri-winged spaceship lost sight of Su Lu at the same time. Damn. You are running too damn fast now, even I can't keep up with you. Philip's voice screamed exaggeratedly, and after a moment it suddenly deepened. Lei, where are you going? It was a Sunday night. Zhou came to Lin Yuan according to her habit of many years. She came to the bamboo house, put the pink windbreaker beside her, and sat cross-legged in silence. Only a very small number of women could wear peach red, and dared to wear peach red. However, it was probably only a woman like her, whose face was as beautiful as the north wind outside the window, whose heart was growing stronger by the day, but who firmly maintained a certain gentleness, could wear peach red with an extraordinary feeling. The manager, who was familiar with her, stood by her side. He did not need to hand over the menu, as he had already prepared the dishes in advance. He was very clear about the recent major events in the Federation, so he was not surprised that the young lady's expression was colder than before, and he would not tactfully take out a certain year of red wine for her to taste. He just politely completed the necessary work, and tactfully left the room in silence. It was still Lin Yuan, still the bamboo house beside the flowing water and fallen leaves, and still the same position. Through the window she could still see the private jet taking off and landing under the white cliff, but there was one less person on the opposite side of the table. Although that guy was used to smiling quietly and did not speak much, especially when he showed his terrifying appetite, she was still not used to it. After thinking so much, Zhou smiled. Recently she knew some details of the military prison riot, and guessed that it might be investigated by the government, but she did not regret it, because it was really interesting to see that guy tossing around so much. After eating steamed shad and 3 glasses of special rice wine, she was a little tired. As usual, she held her chin and leaned on the table tiredly, and then saw a very subtle handwriting on the side of the table. Zhou was stunned for a long time, and then a slightly bitter smile appeared on her lips. She muttered to herself, "Both of them are so cautious and careful, and have prepared everything in advance. They are really brother and sister." She took out the eyebrow-trimming tweezers from her dressing bag. Her eyebrows were slightly knitted, but the tip of the tweezers did not touch her eyebrows. Instead, it fell on the table, and under the cover of sleepiness, she wrote a few numbers. In the middle of the night, Su Lu once again sneaked into the Lin Yuan. After silently memorizing the row of numbers that represented the precise geographical location, his fingers slowly moved across the table. With a light, rustling sound, a thin layer of precious wood suddenly disappeared from the table. What was once written there, no one would know. In the early morning, Su Lu once again escaped from the capital. Following the road that led to the back of Macho Mountain, under the cover of the darkest night, he crossed the fields and small streams, and turned west at the foot of the mountain. He pulled out the electronic map in his bracelet and confirmed that the pipeline in the hills was marked on the map. It was an underground tunnel that was specially built by HTD Bureau for the vagrant toads to lay eggs. With difficulty, he crawled through the narrow and long pipeline, pushed aside the weeds in front of him, stood up in the morning light, and looked back at the electronic fence in the distance. Sulu was sure that the Federal Central Computer did not notice that someone had entered the wildlife sanctuary. Following the coordinates on the map, he walked into the depths of the sanctuary. Along the way, he passed by many tidal flats and wetlands formed by the water of Macho Lake. Occasionally, he would see a few early insects that were fighting with the condensed dew. Looking at the tiny and touching pictures, the weird feeling in Suli's heart grew more and more intense. He felt that the abilities that the radiance of the charter had shown in the past few days were far less than what he had predicted. Was it really because the soulless central computer of the Federation was like the dew on a leaf that was frozen by the cold wind, and could only accept the teasing of insects clumsily and passively? If that was really the case, then he was very confident that he could win this war. Especially after leaving planet S1, the charter's positioning time would be affected by the long distance. Just as he was thinking about these things, Sulu arrived at the destination of his trip. Then, he saw a very shocking scene. The core area of the wildlife sanctuary was an area of shallow grass. The early morning sun slanted through the morning fog, making the water in the water reflect a pearl-like luster. In the middle of the wetland there was a slope. On the slope there was a tree. In the winter, all the leaves had fallen, leaving only dead branches, proudly standing in the middle of the yellow grass. Under the tree was the princess of the empire who was being hunted down by the Federation. Hui Chaoshi leaned against the withered tree with her head lowered, reading a book. Her expression was as calm as usual. Chapter 825. If I didn't make a mistake, this would probably be the best work of 2010. The title is very flashy, but that's what Andy Lau said. I just used it to attract attention. All I wanted to say and could say was thank you. Does that count as deserving of the title? Of course it does, because that's what I think, and you all think so too. This has nothing to do with narcissism, and it has nothing to do with the phrase, no one is the best in literature. In my opinion, this is the attitude that every person who makes a living by writing should have. You have to think that you write well before you can write what others think is well written. Friends who don't think so are also good friends. I sincerely hug you, and hope that the next book will make you think so, because I will definitely write better and better. I have confidence and attitude about this. Looking at it from a different angle, writing a novel was also a type of work that required proficiency. Apart from some talents that I was quite envious of, the rest was nothing more than hard work, bad writing skills, constant practice, and familiarity with reading thousands of books. There were also a lot of sixth and seventh words that I wouldn't list. Of course, it's not pure. I've liked to write since I was very young. I was often praised for my essays in elementary school, but I loved to write even more in middle school. After that, I was never praised again. This was because my Chinese language representative was really talented. I was very envious, jealous, and hateful. I started writing in high school, and even took my weekly journal seriously. But unfortunately, my high school Chinese language representative was also really King talented. I was even more envious, jealous, and hateful. When I went to university, I was still writing, and then I realized that what I loved the most in life was writing, so I kept writing after that. I wrote a lot, and a lot of words were burned long ago. Along with the hard drive, there were also some that I hid because they were really ugly. Babies don't know how to walk when they are born, and no one knows how to write when they are born. It's best not to show off the early photos of wearing open crotch pants. I practiced a little, so the things I wrote can be sold for money, can be used, and can continue to write, which is very good. As for my two language representatives, they haven't been doing this for many years. One of them was still lamenting about it when we were talking about it 2 years ago. Of course, they earn more money than me, but they can still type on the keyboard every day, so I feel that I am happier in this aspect. I'm a little tired. I'm going to sleep. Other than thanking you, There's nothing else I can do. I just have to seriously write every single story. I shrug my shoulders. Just like today's third chapter, I'm very satisfied. Then, there was the promise that I made in the past. Until I die or am too old to write anymore, I will continue to write and write stories for everyone to read. I'll try my best to write until you're sick of it. Then, I'll show it to your future generations. I'll make a lot of money. The best author of 2009, the best novel of 2010. I am very satisfied and I thank you again. He bowed sincerely and left the stage. Oh, I also want a monthly ticket and a recommendation ticket. After thinking about it, I've confirmed that this is indeed a reflection of your attitude. It's up to you whether you want to give it or not, and it's up to you whether you want to give it or not. It's my professional attitude. Selling sesame seed cakes didn't necessarily mean that the sesame seed cakes were bad, and it didn't mean that I was a sesame seed cake, but I definitely had deeper thoughts about selling sesame seed cakes. You're tuning in to the Phoenix Nights YouTube channel. Don't forget to subscribe and join us on this journey to catch the most captivating stories.